To understand how completely Miranda misjudged the woman she would humiliate at the Wellington Foundation Gala, you need to understand exactly who Margaret Thompson appeared to be in the eyes of everyone who thought they knew her, because the carefully constructed image of a simple, working-class grandmother was so convincing that it had fooled not just my daughter-in-law, but an entire community that had no idea they were interacting with one of the most powerful philanthropists in the country. The persona I had cultivated over the past decade wasn't accidental or unconscious. It was a deliberate, carefully planned strategy that allowed me to observe people's true character while remaining completely invisible to those who judged others based on superficial markers of wealth and social status. Every detail of my appearance, behavior, and lifestyle had been designed to create the impression of a woman who was hardworking, humble, and completely unremarkable in terms of power or influence. When people encountered Margaret Thompson in her daily life, they saw a 72-year-old woman who embodied every stereotype about elderly working-class women in America. I drove a 12-year-old Honda Civic with over 180,000 miles. Its silver paint faded from years of Pacific Northwest rain, and its interior showing the wear that comes from practical use rather than careful preservation. The car was reliable and economical, exactly what someone on a fixed income would choose for basic transportation needs. My clothing reinforced this impression of modest circumstances and practical priorities. I shopped primarily at department stores like Macy's and Nordstrom Rack, choosing well-made but unremarkable pieces that would last for years without requiring replacement. My wardrobe consisted mainly of cardigans, sensible blouses, comfortable slacks, and practical shoes that prioritized comfort and durability over fashion or style. For family gatherings and social events, I would typically wear simple dresses in navy blue or charcoal gray, paired with small pearl earrings that had been my mother's, and a modest gold wedding band that I had continued wearing long after my husband's death 15 years earlier. These choices created an image of someone who valued tradition and frugality over contemporary style or expensive accessories. My hair was styled in the same practical manner that millions of women my age adopted when they decided that convenience was more important than vanity. I wore it pulled back in a simple bun or ponytail, with minimal styling products and no attempt to hide the silver color that had gradually replaced the auburn brown of my younger years. The style was neat and professional, but entirely unremarkable in any social setting. But perhaps the most convincing aspect of my carefully constructed persona was my behavior in social and professional situations. I had perfected the art of appearing slightly overwhelmed by modern technology, asking for help with smartphone functions that I could easily manage myself, and expressing confusion about social media platforms that I actually understood better than most people half my age. During family dinners at restaurants, I would study the menu carefully and make comments about prices that suggested someone who needed to budget carefully for small luxuries. I would ask servers about portion sizes and request modifications that indicated familiarity with institutional dining rather than fine cuisine. I would express appreciation for meals that cost less than what many people spent on coffee drinks. When David and Miranda invited me to their condominium for dinner parties, I would arrive carrying casseroles or desserts in simple glass baking dishes, the kind of contribution that suggested someone who enjoyed cooking but couldn't afford to purchase expensive gifts or wine. These homemade contributions were always delicious and appreciated, but they reinforced the impression that I was someone who contributed labor rather than money to social gatherings. My conversational style in these social settings was carefully calibrated to seem interested but not particularly knowledgeable about topics like investments, luxury travel, or high-end consumer goods. When other guests discussed their vacation plans to Europe or their experiences with expensive restaurants, I would listen politely and ask simple questions that indicated I found their lifestyle fascinating but completely outside my own experience. I would make comments about how different their world seemed from my own daily life, expressing gentle amazement at the costs associated with luxury travel, designer clothing, or expensive hobbies. These responses weren't mocking or resentful. They seemed genuinely curious and slightly wistful, as if I was someone who appreciated beautiful things but had long ago accepted that they would never be part of my own life. The most convincing aspect of this performance was that it contained elements of truth that made it psychologically authentic. I genuinely did appreciate frugality and practical living, having learned during my early career that financial discipline and modest lifestyle choices provided freedom and security that were more valuable than temporary luxuries or status symbols. I had also developed genuine relationships with people from all economic backgrounds through my charitable work, and I maintained friendships with teachers, nurses, social workers, and other professionals whose incomes were modest but whose contributions to society were immeasurable. These relationships weren't calculated or artificial. They reflected my authentic belief that a person's worth was determined by their character and contributions rather than their economic status. But the persona I projected to people like Miranda was carefully edited to emphasize only certain aspects of my personality and experience, while concealing the wealth, influence, and professional accomplishments that would have completely changed how I was perceived and treated. The editing process was most evident in how I discussed my work history and current activities. When people asked about my career, I would mention that I had worked for various nonprofit organizations throughout my adult life, handling administrative tasks and helping with fundraising activities. This description was technically accurate but gave no indication of the leadership roles I had held or the scale of the organizations I had managed. I would describe my current activities as volunteer work with several charitable organizations, helping with events and administrative tasks that kept me busy and provided opportunities to contribute to causes I cared about. Again, this description was accurate, but completely understated the reality of my ongoing role as Chairman Emeritus of the Wellington Foundation and my continued involvement in major philanthropic initiatives throughout the region. When conversations turned to financial topics, I would make casual comments about the importance of careful budgeting and living within one's means, expressing mild concern about rising costs of healthcare and utilities that suggested someone on a fixed income who needed to monitor expenses carefully. I would mention that I was grateful for Medicare and Social Security, giving the impression that these programs were essential for my financial security rather than simply one component of a comprehensive retirement plan. The most sophisticated aspect of my deception involved my living situation and the modest home where I had lived for the past 20 years. The house itself was genuinely modest, a 3-bedroom ranch-style home in a middle-class neighborhood where most residents were teachers, nurses, government employees, and retirees with comfortable but unremarkable incomes. The house was well-maintained, but deliberately understated, with landscaping that was neat and attractive without being elaborate or expensive. The interior was furnished with a mixture of antique pieces that had been family heirlooms and contemporary furniture that was comfortable and attractive without being luxurious or designer-branded. Visitors to my home would see exactly what they expected to see based on my personal presentation, a comfortable, unpretentious living space that reflected someone who valued quality and durability but didn't have unlimited resources for decoration or luxury purchases. The overall impression was of someone who had worked hard throughout her life and was now enjoying a modest but secure retirement supported by careful saving and practical lifestyle choices. But what visitors couldn't see was that the modest house sat on property that was worth significantly more than appeared, located in a neighborhood that had appreciated dramatically over the past 2 decades due to its proximity to major employers and transportation infrastructure. The house itself was fully paid for and maintained through property management services that handled all repairs and improvements without requiring my direct involvement or financial stress. More importantly, what visitors couldn't see was the sophisticated home office located in the basement, equipped with state-of-the-art computer systems, secure communication equipment, and comprehensive filing systems that contained documentation of 42 years of philanthropic activities and financial management. This office was where I conducted the ongoing business of the Wellington Foundation and managed the investment portfolio that generated millions of dollars annually for charitable distribution. The basement office was accessible through a separate entrance that most visitors never noticed, and it was soundproofed and climate-controlled to protect the sensitive documents and equipment that were essential for my continued work in philanthropic leadership. But from the perspective of casual visitors, my home appeared to be exactly what a retired nonprofit administrator might be expected to live in. The deception extended to my daily routines and activities, which were structured to reinforce the impression of someone whose life was modest, predictable, and centered around simple pleasures and community involvement. I maintained regular schedules that included grocery shopping at middle market stores, exercising at the local community center, and attending services at a Methodist church where I had been a member for over 15 years. These activities weren't just performance. They reflected genuine aspects of my personality and values. I enjoyed the sense of community that came from shopping at the same grocery store for years and knowing the employees by name. I appreciated the democratic atmosphere of the community center, where people of all ages and backgrounds worked out together without the exclusivity and pretension that characterized expensive private fitness clubs. The Methodist Church provided spiritual grounding and community connection that were important to me personally, but my involvement there was also strategically valuable because it reinforced the impression of someone whose priorities were spiritual and community-oriented rather than focused on wealth accumulation or social status advancement. At church, I would participate in potluck dinners, volunteer for community service projects, and contribute to fundraising activities in ways that were generous, but not ostentatious. I would bring homemade pies to church events, help with cleanup after services, and participate in Bible study groups where discussions focused on faith, service, and moral responsibility rather than material success or social advancement. My church involvement also provided opportunities to interact with people from diverse economic backgrounds in contexts where wealth and social status were explicitly de-emphasized in favor of shared spiritual values and mutual support. These interactions helped maintain my perspective on what was truly important in life, while also providing authentic relationships that weren't affected by considerations of wealth or social climbing. The success of my carefully constructed persona was evident in how people responded to me in various social settings. Restaurant servers would treat me with polite efficiency, but wouldn't expect large tips or special treatment. Retail employees would be helpful but wouldn't assume I was a significant customer who might make large purchases. Medical office staff would be professional but wouldn't provide the enhanced service that was typically reserved for patients with premium insurance or obvious wealth. These interactions were actually refreshing because they allowed me to experience how most people were treated in commercial and professional settings, without the deference and special attention that my true economic status would have generated. I learned a great deal about customer service, social dynamics, and human nature by observing how people behaved when they believed they were dealing with someone who had no particular influence or importance. But perhaps the most valuable aspect of my modest persona was how it affected family relationships, allowing me to observe my son David and his wife Miranda without the complications that would have arisen if they had understood my true financial situation and social influence. David's genuine love and respect for me seemed completely unaffected by his belief that I was someone with modest means who had worked hard throughout her life and was now enjoying a simple but secure retirement. His treatment of me was consistently loving, respectful, and considerate, in ways that suggested his values were aligned with genuine family loyalty rather than financial opportunism. David would call regularly to check on my welfare, invite me to dinner parties and family celebrations, and include me in holiday plans without any indication that he viewed me as a burden or social liability. When I needed assistance with household repairs, transportation, or technology issues, David would respond promptly and graciously, treating these requests as normal family obligations rather than inconveniences. His behavior toward me provided reassurance that my decision to conceal my wealth had been wise, because it allowed our relationship to develop based on authentic family bonds rather than financial considerations. David's love for me was genuine and unconditional, unaffected by considerations of inheritance or social advantage. Miranda's treatment of me, however, had revealed exactly the kind of character flaws that my modest persona was designed to expose. From the beginning of her relationship with David, Miranda had treated me with barely concealed condescension that indicated she viewed me as someone whose humble background was embarrassing and whose presence in their social circle was a liability rather than an asset. Miranda's condescending attitude had manifested in countless small ways over the 3 years of her marriage to David. She would speak to me in the overly loud, simplified tone that some people used when talking to elderly people they assumed were confused or hard of hearing. She would explain basic concepts as if I couldn't possibly understand modern technology, social media, or contemporary culture. When Miranda and David hosted dinner parties, Miranda would seat me away from her more impressive guests, usually with other older relatives or family friends who she considered less socially valuable. She would introduce me with phrases like, "This is David's mother. She does volunteer work with charities, in a tone that suggested this was something quaint and harmless rather than professionally significant. Most revealing was Miranda's behavior during gift-giving occasions and family celebrations. She would give me presents that were obviously chosen based on stereotypes about elderly women, rather than any understanding of my actual interests or preferences. Generic candles, simple bath products, and household items that suggested she viewed me as someone whose life was so limited that any small luxury would be appreciated. The contrast between Miranda's gifts to me and her gifts to other family members was stark and telling. David's cousins, who were young professionals with good incomes, would receive thoughtful presents that reflected genuine consideration of their interests and lifestyles. David himself would receive expensive accessories or experiences that reinforced his professional image and social status. But I would receive gifts that cost $15 or $20 and seemed chosen specifically to reinforce the impression that I was someone whose needs were simple and whose expectations should be minimal. The message was clear. Miranda viewed me as someone who should be grateful for small gestures, rather than someone who deserved the same level of consideration given to family members she respected. Miranda's treatment of me during family gatherings was particularly revealing because it demonstrated her complete lack of curiosity about my background, experiences, or perspectives. She would listen politely when I spoke, but never asked follow-up questions or expressed interest in learning more about my life or opinions. When conversations turned to topics like current events, community issues, or social problems, Miranda would either change the subject or respond with superficial comments that indicated she assumed I couldn't contribute meaningful insights to serious discussions. She seemed to view me as someone whose role in family gatherings was to provide generational decoration rather than substantive conversation. This dismissive attitude extended to Miranda's treatment of my suggestions, opinions, and offers of assistance. When I would offer to help with party planning, cooking, or other family obligations, Miranda would decline in ways that suggested she was being polite, rather than genuinely considering whether my help might be valuable. "That's so sweet of you to offer, Margaret," Miranda would say in response to my attempts to contribute to family activities. "But we've got everything handled. You just relax and enjoy yourself." The patronizing tone and automatic dismissal indicated that Miranda couldn't imagine that someone with my apparent background might have useful skills or valuable contributions to offer. The most insulting aspect of Miranda's behavior was her obvious relief when family gatherings ended and she no longer had to manage the social awkwardness that she believed my presence created. She would make comments to David about how well family events had gone, with subtle implications that success was measured partly by how effectively she had minimized any potential embarrassment caused by having a working-class mother-in-law. "I think everyone had a wonderful time tonight," Miranda would tell David after dinner parties, "and your mother seemed to really enjoy meeting everyone." The phrasing suggested that my enjoyment was something Miranda had generously facilitated rather than a natural result of family hospitality and inclusion. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of Miranda's attitude toward me was her complete lack of interest in my volunteer work and community involvement. Despite the fact that charitable activities were supposedly important to her social advancement strategy, Miranda never asked about the organizations I worked with, the causes I supported, or the activities I participated in through my volunteer work. This lack of curiosity was particularly telling because Miranda attended charity events regularly as part of her effort to build social connections and establish her reputation in the community. She would spend hundreds of dollars on tickets to fundraising galas and would research the guest lists to identify people she hoped to meet and impress. But when it came to my charitable involvement, Miranda seemed to assume that anything I participated in was probably small-scale and insignificant, not worth her attention or consideration. She would listen politely when I mentioned upcoming charity events or fundraising activities, but she never asked for details or expressed interest in learning more about the causes involved. The irony was that Miranda's dismissive attitude toward my charitable work had prevented her from learning about organizations and events that could have been valuable for her own social advancement goals. The Wellington Foundation Gala, where she would make her catastrophic mistake, was exactly the kind of high-profile charity event that Miranda had been trying to gain access to for years. If Miranda had shown genuine interest in my community involvement, she might have learned about opportunities to participate in charitable activities that would have enhanced her social standing while also contributing to meaningful causes. Instead, her condescending assumptions about my volunteer work had blinded her to possibilities that could have advanced her own goals, while also building genuine connections with the philanthropic community. The charitable community in the Pacific Northwest was relatively small and interconnected, with many of the same business leaders, social influencers, and wealthy families participating in multiple organizations and events throughout the year. Someone who was genuinely committed to charitable work and community involvement could build substantial social connections and influence through authentic participation in these activities. But Miranda's approach to charity events was purely transactional, focused on networking opportunities and social advancement, rather than genuine concern for the causes being supported. She would attend galas and fundraisers to be seen and to meet influential people, but she rarely made meaningful donations or participated in ongoing volunteer activities that would have demonstrated authentic commitment to charitable work. This superficial approach to charitable involvement was immediately obvious to people who were genuinely committed to philanthropic activities. Experienced charity volunteers and donors could instantly identify people who were attending events for social reasons rather than charitable ones, and Miranda's behavior at these events had marked her as someone who was using charitable activities for personal advancement rather than community service. The established members of the charitable community had politely tolerated Miranda's presence at events, but had never welcomed her into their inner circles or invited her to participate in more exclusive or influential activities. They had correctly identified her as someone whose motivations were selfish rather than altruistic, and they had responded accordingly. Miranda's failure to gain acceptance among serious philanthropists had frustrated her social advancement goals and had contributed to her increasing desperation to establish herself as someone worthy of inclusion in elite social circles. She had begun to blame her lack of progress on external factors rather than recognizing that her superficial approach and obvious self-interest were preventing her from building the authentic relationships that would have provided the social status she craved. This frustration had made Miranda increasingly critical of people and circumstances that she viewed as obstacles to her social goals. My apparent working-class background had become a particular source of resentment, because Miranda believed that having a mother-in-law with humble circumstances was damaging her social image and preventing her from being taken seriously by the wealthy and influential people she hoped to cultivate as friends. "It's just difficult when people judge you based on your family background," Miranda had complained to David during one of their discussions about her social activities. "I work so hard to build relationships and establish our reputation, and then people meet your mother and they assume we're not really their kind of people." This complaint revealed Miranda's fundamental misunderstanding of how social dynamics actually worked among genuine philanthropists and community leaders. She assumed that people judged others based on family wealth and social connections, when in reality, the charitable community valued authenticity, commitment, and genuine concern for others above superficial markers of status. Miranda's obsession with appearances and social climbing had prevented her from understanding that the people she most wanted to impress were actually more likely to respect someone who came from humble circumstances and had worked hard to build a meaningful life than someone who had married into wealth and was obviously focused on personal advancement rather than community service. But Miranda's misconceptions about social dynamics had created a situation where she viewed me as a liability, rather than recognizing that my authentic character and genuine community involvement could have been assets for her own social goals if she had approached our relationship with respect and curiosity, rather than condescension and embarrassment. The Wellington Foundation Gala would provide the perfect opportunity for Miranda to discover exactly how wrong she had been about social dynamics, community values, and the importance of treating everyone with respect regardless of their apparent circumstances. The woman Miranda thought she could dismiss as just the janitor was about to reveal exactly who she really was, and the revelation would destroy everything Miranda had worked to build, while demonstrating that true power and influence came from service to others, rather than self-interested social climbing. The stage was set for a confrontation that would expose Miranda's character flaws to exactly the people she had been trying to impress, and the consequences would be as swift as they were devastating. Miranda was about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who looks like they couldn't possibly hurt you. And I was going to enjoy every moment of her education. What my daughter-in-law Miranda didn't know when she told security to remove me from the Wellington Foundation charity gala because I was just the janitor was that I had spent 42 years building one of the most successful philanthropic empires in the country, and this time I was going to use every connection, every dollar, and every ounce of influence I'd accumulated to show her that humiliating someone who had dedicated her life to charitable work was the most catastrophic social mistake of her pathetic gold-digging existence. Before I tell you how my own son's wife learned that treating a 70-year-old woman like disposable help can destroy your entire social standing and marriage in a single evening, tell me where you're watching from. And if this story of betrayal and perfectly orchestrated social justice resonates with you, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Because tomorrow, I have another incredible story of family revenge that will absolutely blow your mind. My name is Margaret Maggie Thompson. I'm 72 years old, and I'm about to tell you how my daughter-in-law Miranda, a woman who married into our family purely for financial security, thought she could dismiss me as nothing more than hired help at the most prestigious charity event of the year, only to discover that the humble cleaning woman she saw as beneath her notice was actually Margaret Thompson, founder and chairman emeritus of the Thompson Foundation, the organization that had donated over $50 million to make the... You see, when people look at me today, they see exactly what Miranda saw that night. A petite, 72-year-old woman with steel gray hair pulled back in a practical bun, wearing a simple navy blue uniform dress with comfortable walking shoes, carrying a modest canvas bag that could easily contain cleaning supplies. They see someone who moves quietly through elegant spaces, someone who works with her hands, someone who represents service rather than power, someone who might be grateful for steady employment but certainly couldn't command the attention of billionaires, celebrities, and political leaders who attend events like the Wellington Foundation Gala. Miranda had been seeing me this way for the past 3 years, ever since she married my son David and moved into what she assumed was a wealthy family that would provide her with the luxurious lifestyle she had always craved. She would watch me arrive at family gatherings in my modest Honda Civic, wearing department store clothing and carrying casseroles in simple glass dishes, and she would respond with barely concealed disdain for what she interpreted as my lower-class background and humble circumstances. In Miranda's mind, I was exactly what I appeared to be, David's embarrassing mother who had worked menial jobs her entire life, someone who needed to be managed carefully during social situations to avoid damaging the sophisticated image that Miranda was trying to cultivate as the wife of a successful investment banker. What Miranda didn't know, what she'd never bothered to learn despite 3 years of marriage to my son, was that the woman she saw as socially inferior had actually built one of the most respected philanthropic organizations in the country, had been personally responsible for distributing over $200 million in charitable funding, and maintained relationships with some of the most powerful and influential people in business, politics, and entertainment. But I had learned, long ago in my career, that sometimes the most effective way to understand people's true character is to let them believe you're powerless to challenge their behavior. When wealthy donors, corporate executives, and social climbers thought they were dealing with someone who couldn't possibly threaten their status or expose their secrets, they revealed exactly who they really were beneath their carefully constructed public personas. So I had become very skilled at blending into the background when it served my purposes, observing how people treated those they considered beneath them, and gathering information about character and motivations that would have been impossible to obtain if they knew they were being evaluated by someone who could affect their careers, reputations, and social standing. Miranda had failed this character test so spectacularly that her behavior had become a source of concern not just for me but for David, who was beginning to understand that his wife's treatment of service workers, elderly relatives, and anyone she considered socially inferior revealed fundamental problems with her values and priorities. Instead of treating my apparent humble circumstances with kindness and respect, Miranda had become increasingly condescending and dismissive over the years. Instead of appreciating the opportunity to build a genuine relationship with David's mother, she had begun to see me as a social liability that needed to be minimized or, when possible, excluded entirely from events where her carefully curated image might be compromised. More troubling, Miranda had begun to make comments about how embarrassing it was that David's mother worked in menial jobs, and how much easier her social life would be if I could just understand my place and avoid situations where I might interact with her friends or professional contacts. These comments revealed Miranda's complete misunderstanding of both family relationships and social dynamics. She assumed that a person's value was determined entirely by their apparent economic status and professional position, and that anyone who didn't meet her standards for wealth and sophistication was inherently inferior and deserving of dismissive treatment. But Miranda's condescending attitude toward my apparent working-class background was just one symptom of a much larger problem with her character and her approach to relationships. Over the past 3 years, I had watched my son's wife transform from someone who had initially seemed loving and supportive into someone who viewed other people primarily in terms of what they could do for her social advancement, or how they might interfere with her plans for upward mobility. The transformation hadn't been sudden or dramatic. It had been a gradual process that began almost immediately after Miranda and David's honeymoon, when she started to understand that marrying into the Thompson family didn't automatically provide her with the instant wealth and social status she had expected. Miranda Rodriguez had met my son David at a charity fundraiser in downtown Seattle 2 years before their marriage. She was working as an event coordinator for a mid-tier catering company, managing logistics for corporate events and social gatherings that allowed her to observe the lifestyles of wealthy clients while remaining firmly outside their social circles. Miranda was undeniably attractive, tall and elegant, with dark hair and striking features that photographed well at social events. But more importantly, she possessed an almost supernatural ability to present herself as exactly what wealthy, successful men thought they wanted in a partner. Sophisticated enough to navigate high society social situations, but not so accomplished that she might compete with their professional achievements or challenge their sense of superiority. When Miranda met David at the Children's Hospital benefit dinner, she was working the event as part of the catering staff, but she had changed into an elegant black dress during her break and was mingling with guests in areas where she wasn't supposed to be. This calculated deception, pretending to be a guest rather than an employee, was the first indication of the character flaws that would eventually destroy her marriage and social standing. David, who was attending the event as a representative of his investment firm, was immediately attracted to Miranda's beauty and apparent sophistication. She seemed to understand the social dynamics of charity events, could discuss art and culture with apparent knowledge, and projected the kind of refined elegance that David had been seeking in his previous dating experiences. What David didn't realize was that Miranda's knowledge of high society culture came from years of observing wealthy clients from a service position, not from genuine education or experience. Her understanding of art, wine, and luxury goods was superficial but carefully practiced, designed to impress people who weren't looking too closely at the depth of her knowledge. Miranda's strategy worked perfectly. Within 6 months of their meeting, David was completely infatuated with her. Convinced that he had found a woman who could match his social and professional aspirations while providing the kind of supportive partnership that would enhance his career and personal life. The courtship period was a masterclass in manipulation and calculated performance. Miranda presented herself as someone who was independently successful but not career-obsessed, financially stable but not materialistic, and socially connected but not demanding. She carefully managed every interaction to reinforce David's belief that she was the perfect partner for someone with his ambitions and lifestyle. But beneath this carefully constructed facade, Miranda was conducting her own investigation into David's family background, financial situation, and long-term earning potential. She researched his career trajectory, analyzed his investment portfolio, and even conducted subtle inquiries into his family's wealth and social connections. This financial background check revealed that David earned approximately $200,000 annually as a senior associate at Patterson & Associates, a respected investment firm in Seattle. His personal assets included a condominium in the trendy Capitol Hill neighborhood, a diversified investment portfolio worth approximately $400,000, and a BMW sedan that he had purchased to project professional success. While David's financial situation was comfortable by most standards, it wasn't the kind of substantial wealth that Miranda had hoped to access through marriage. But her research had also revealed that David was the only son of Margaret Thompson, and Miranda's attempts to investigate my background had yielded confusing and contradictory information that suggested either significant hidden wealth or some kind of family secret that might be worth exploring. Public records showed that I owned a modest house in a middle-class neighborhood, drove an older Honda Civic, and had no obvious sources of significant income. But Miranda's superficial investigation had also uncovered references to various charitable organizations and community involvement that seemed inconsistent with the working-class background she had assumed based on my lifestyle and appearance. The contradiction between my apparent modest circumstances and my apparent community involvement created a mystery that Miranda couldn't solve using the limited research methods available to her. But rather than investigating further or asking direct questions, she had simply assumed that any charitable involvement I might have was probably volunteer work or small-scale community service that wasn't particularly significant or valuable. This assumption was typical of Miranda's approach to relationships and social dynamics. She made judgments based on surface appearances and immediate impressions, never bothering to investigate deeper or consider that people might have more complex backgrounds than what was immediately visible. Miranda's superficial approach to understanding people extended to her relationship with David as well. She had fallen in love with his earning potential and social status rather than his character or personality, which meant that she never developed the kind of deep emotional connection that would have made their marriage sustainable when challenges arose. But David, who was genuinely caring and emotionally invested in their relationship, interpreted Miranda's calculated behavior as natural compatibility and mutual attraction. He believed that her interest in his career and financial goals reflected shared values and common priorities, when in reality, it represented a transactional approach to relationships that would eventually destroy their marriage. The wedding planning process had been the first major indication of Miranda's true priorities and character. Rather than focusing on creating a meaningful ceremony that reflected their relationship and values, Miranda had become obsessed with creating an expensive, elaborate event that would establish her social status and generate the kind of publicity that would enhance her reputation among the wealthy and influential people she hoped to cultivate as friends and connections. Miranda's vision for their wedding was a 300-guest extravaganza at the Four Seasons Hotel, with a budget that exceeded $70,000 and included details that were designed more for Instagram photographs than for genuine celebration. She wanted designer flowers, premium catering, professional photography, and entertainment that would create talking points for society pages and social media coverage. David, who had initially been supportive of Miranda's wedding plans, gradually became uncomfortable with the expense and ostentation of the event she was planning. He suggested that a smaller, more intimate celebration might be more meaningful and financially responsible, but Miranda had responded with tears and accusations that he didn't understand the importance of making a good impression on the people who would be crucial to their future social and professional success. "David, this wedding is about more than just one day," Miranda had explained during one of their planning discussions. "It's about establishing our position in the community and showing people that we're serious about building something important together. If we have some cheap, small wedding, people will think we're not successful or ambitious." Quote, the phrase "establishing our position" was particularly revealing because it demonstrated that Miranda viewed their marriage as a business transaction rather than a romantic relationship. She was using their wedding as a marketing event designed to promote her personal brand and social status, not as a celebration of their love and commitment to each other. But David, who was deeply in love and wanted to make Miranda happy, had ultimately agreed to the expensive wedding she wanted. He had liquidated investments, taken out loans, and even borrowed money from his retirement savings to pay for the event that Miranda convinced him was essential for their future success. The irony was that Miranda's elaborate wedding had been held at the same Four Seasons Hotel where the Wellington Foundation had hosted its annual gala for the past 15 years. The hotel staff who had served Miranda's 300-guest wedding were the same people who had worked with me to organize events that had raised millions of dollars for charitable causes throughout the Pacific Northwest. But Miranda had been so focused on her own social performance that she had never bothered to ask about the venue's history or significance. She had simply chosen the Four Seasons because it was expensive and prestigious, not because she understood its connection to the charitable community that had been central to my life's work. The wedding itself had been a beautiful event that successfully achieved Miranda's goal of establishing her social status and generating admiration from the guests who attended. But the aftermath had revealed the fundamental problems with Miranda's approach to relationships and financial responsibility. The $70,000 wedding had consumed most of David's liquid assets and created debt that would take years to repay. But rather than acknowledging the financial stress that her demands had created, Miranda had immediately begun planning for the next phase of her social advancement, which involved purchasing a larger home, upgrading their vehicles, and maintaining a lifestyle that would reinforce the impression of success that she had created through their wedding. David, who was now struggling to maintain their standard of living while paying off wedding debt, had begun to understand that Miranda's approach to money and social status was fundamentally incompatible with his own values and long-term financial goals. But he was also deeply committed to their marriage and hoped that Miranda would eventually understand the importance of financial responsibility and shared sacrifice. Instead, Miranda had become increasingly demanding and critical of David's earning potential, suggesting that he should pursue more aggressive career advancement strategies that would generate the kind of income necessary to support the lifestyle she believed they deserved. "David, I don't understand why you're not more ambitious about your career," Miranda had said during one of their financial discussions. "You're smart and talented, but you're not doing anything to distinguish yourself or advance to the next level. I need to know that you're committed to building something significant, not just maintaining the status quo." The pressure that Miranda was placing on David to earn more money and achieve higher professional status was creating stress that was affecting his work performance and personal well-being. But more importantly, it was revealing that Miranda's love was conditional on his ability to provide her with the financial security and social status that she had married him to obtain. This transactional approach to their relationship had become increasingly evident in Miranda's behavior toward David's family and friends. She had begun to evaluate all of his relationships in terms of their potential value for her social advancement, encouraging him to maintain connections with people who might be useful, while discouraging relationships that she considered beneath their aspirations. My relationship with Miranda had been particularly complicated because she couldn't immediately determine whether I was an asset or a liability for her social goals. My apparent working-class background suggested that I might be embarrassing in social situations, but my obvious importance to David meant that she couldn't simply dismiss me without creating marriage problems that might threaten her financial security. Miranda's solution had been to try to manage my involvement in their lives, allowing me to participate in family events while carefully controlling the circumstances to minimize any potential damage to her social image. She would invite me to dinner parties, but seat me away from her important friends. She would include me in family photographs, but edit me out of images that she shared on social media. But perhaps most revealing was Miranda's attitude toward the volunteer work that she assumed I was doing with various charitable organizations. Rather than viewing community service as admirable or valuable, Miranda had treated my charitable involvement as a hobby that was acceptable as long as it didn't interfere with her social plans or create obligations that might inconvenience her schedule. "It's sweet that your mother likes to help with charity work," Miranda had told David during one of their conversations about family obligations, "but she needs to understand that we can't always accommodate her volunteer schedule when we have important social commitments." The condescending phrase, "it's sweet," revealed exactly how Miranda viewed charitable work and community service. In her mind, helping others was a quaint pastime that was suitable for people who didn't have more important things to do, not a serious commitment that deserved respect and support. This attitude toward charitable work was particularly ironic, given that Miranda had met David at a charity event and had built her entire social strategy around attending fundraisers and gala events. But Miranda viewed these events as networking opportunities rather than genuine charitable activities, and she had never bothered to learn about the causes being supported or the people whose lives were being affected by the charitable work. Miranda's superficial approach to charitable involvement was just one example of her broader pattern of engaging with activities and relationships only to the extent that they served her personal goals. She had no genuine interest in helping others or contributing to causes that were larger than her own immediate needs and desires. This selfishness had become increasingly obvious over the 3 years of her marriage to David, as she had gradually abandoned any pretense of caring about anyone other than herself. Friends who couldn't provide social advancement were discarded. Family members who weren't useful for her goals were minimized. Even her relationship with David had become increasingly transactional, as she focused more on what he could provide for her than on what she could contribute to their partnership. The charity gala incident wasn't going to be an isolated moment of poor judgment. It was going to be the culmination of 3 years of moral decay and social climbing that had gradually transformed Miranda from someone who had initially seemed capable of genuine love into someone who viewed other people as props in her personal performance of success and sophistication. But what Miranda didn't understand was that her decision to publicly humiliate me at the Wellington Foundation Gala wasn't just a personal betrayal. It was also a strategic mistake that would expose her true character to everyone who mattered in the social world she was trying to conquer. The Wellington Foundation Gala, where Miranda made her catastrophic error, wasn't just another charity event. It was the most prestigious philanthropic gathering in the Pacific Northwest, attended by business leaders, politicians, celebrities, and social influencers, who collectively controlled billions of dollars in charitable funding and social influence. More importantly, the Wellington Foundation Gala was the annual celebration of the organization that I had founded 4 decades earlier and had built into one of the most respected and effective charitable institutions in the country. The event was being held to honor my lifetime of service to the community and to announce the largest charitable donation in the foundation's history. Miranda thought she was dismissing a powerless elderly woman who would quietly disappear and never bother her again. What she actually did was provide someone with 42 years of philanthropic leadership experience, with the motivation and opportunity needed to demonstrate exactly what happened when you publicly humiliated someone who had dedicated her life to helping others. The room where Miranda made her mistake was filled with people who knew exactly who I was and what I had accomplished. Business leaders who had worked with me on major charitable initiatives, politicians who had sought my endorsement and support, celebrities who had participated in foundation events, social influencers who understood that my approval could make or break their reputations in the charitable community. When Miranda told security that I was just the janitor and should be removed from the event, she wasn't just insulting me. She was revealing her complete ignorance about the charitable community she was trying to join and her fundamental misunderstanding of how power and influence actually worked in the social world she was trying to conquer. And I was about to show my daughter-in-law exactly what those consequences looked like when delivered by someone who understood power, influence, and social justice at a level she couldn't even begin to comprehend. But the most devastating aspect of Miranda's impending downfall was that she had chosen to humiliate me in front of the one group of people who would understand exactly what she had done and who would never forgive her for treating someone who had dedicated her life to helping others with such contempt and disrespect. The stage was set, the players were in position, and Miranda was about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who looks like they couldn't possibly hurt you. The woman she thought she could dismiss as just the janitor was about to take the stage and deliver a lesson in humility that would destroy everything Miranda had worked to build and ensure that she would never again underestimate the power of someone who had spent their life serving others. Justice was coming, and it was going to be beautiful. To understand the devastating magnitude of Miranda's mistake when she dismissed me as just the janitor at the Wellington Foundation Gala, you need to understand exactly who Margaret Thompson really was beneath the modest grandmother facade. Because the woman she chose to humiliate wasn't just someone who had worked in nonprofit organizations, but the visionary leader who had revolutionized charitable giving in the Pacific Northwest and built one of the most influential philanthropic empires in American history. My journey into philanthropic leadership began in 1981, when I was 28 years old and working as a program coordinator for United Way of King County in Seattle. I had graduated from the University of Washington with a degree in social work, driven by a passion for addressing systemic inequality and creating opportunities for people who had been marginalized by economic and social barriers. But what started as an entry-level position with a modest nonprofit organization would eventually transform into something far beyond what I had ever imagined possible, because I possessed a unique combination of analytical intelligence, strategic vision, and genuine compassion that would prove to be extraordinarily effective at solving the complex problems that plagued traditional charitable organizations. During my early years with United Way, I quickly discovered that the charitable sector was plagued by inefficiencies, duplication of services, and lack of coordination between organizations that were all working towards similar goals but competing for the same limited resources. Small nonprofits were struggling to survive, while larger organizations were accumulating resources they couldn't effectively deploy. More troubling, I observed that much of the charitable funding in our region was being directed towards symptom management rather than addressing the root causes of social problems. Organizations were providing emergency food assistance, temporary shelter, and crisis intervention services, but very little funding was being invested in education, job training, economic development, or systemic changes that could actually solve problems rather than simply managing their ongoing effects. The breakthrough that would define my entire career came when I proposed a radical new approach to charitable funding that focused on measurable outcomes rather than good intentions, and on collaboration between organizations rather than competition for resources. Instead of funding dozens of small programs that provided temporary relief, what if we could coordinate a comprehensive approach that addressed multiple aspects of complex social problems simultaneously? My first major project was developing an integrated approach to addressing homelessness in downtown Seattle, bringing together housing organizations, job training programs, mental health services, substance abuse treatment providers, and educational institutions to create a comprehensive support system that could actually help people transition from homelessness to stable, independent living. The project required convincing more than 20 different organizations to collaborate rather than compete, coordinating funding from federal, state, and local sources, and developing evaluation metrics that could track long-term outcomes rather than just short-term service delivery. It was exactly the kind of complex, multi-stakeholder initiative that most people assumed was impossible to implement effectively. But the results were extraordinary. Over the course of 3 years, our integrated approach helped over 800 people transition from homelessness to stable housing and employment, with a success rate that was more than triple what individual organizations had been achieving through their separate programs. More importantly, the cost per successful outcome was dramatically lower than traditional approaches because we had eliminated duplication of services and created economies of scale that allowed participating organizations to operate more efficiently while serving more people more effectively. The success of the homelessness initiative attracted attention from foundation leaders, government officials, and philanthropists throughout the region who were frustrated with the limited impact of traditional charitable approaches and were looking for more effective ways to address persistent social problems. Within 2 years of the project's completion, I received offers from 3 major foundations to lead similar collaborative initiatives in other areas of social concern. The offer that would change the trajectory of my entire life came from Harrison Wellington, the founder of Wellington Industries and one of the most successful entrepreneurs in Pacific Northwest history. Harrison was 73 years old and had built a manufacturing empire that employed over 15,000 people throughout Washington, Oregon, and Northern California. But despite his business success and substantial wealth, Harrison was deeply troubled by the persistence of poverty, educational inequality, and social problems that seemed immune to traditional charitable interventions. "Margaret," Harrison said during our first meeting in his downtown Seattle office, "I've been giving money to charitable organizations for 30 years, and I'm not convinced that we're actually solving any problems. We're feeding people who are hungry today, but they're still hungry tomorrow. We're providing shelter for people who are homeless this month, but they're still homeless next month. I want to fund approaches that actually change people's lives permanently." Harrison's frustration was shared by many successful business leaders who had accumulated substantial wealth and wanted to use their resources to create meaningful social change, but who were disappointed by the limited impact of traditional charitable giving. They understood that business success required strategic planning, measurable outcomes, and systematic approaches to solving complex problems, but they couldn't find charitable organizations that applied these same principles to social issues. The opportunity Harrison offered was both exciting and daunting. He wanted to create a new kind of philanthropic organization that would apply business principles to charitable work, focusing on measurable outcomes, sustainable solutions, and systemic change rather than temporary relief. He was prepared to provide initial funding of $5 million, but he wanted someone with both nonprofit experience and strategic vision to lead the organization and develop its approach. The Wellington Foundation, as we decided to name it, would be fundamentally different from traditional charitable organizations in several important ways. First, we would focus on addressing root causes of social problems, rather than simply managing their symptoms. Second, we would require rigorous evaluation of all programs, and would continue funding only those initiatives that could demonstrate measurable, sustainable impact. Third, we would prioritize collaboration between organizations rather than competition, bringing together the best aspects of multiple approaches to create comprehensive solutions that no single organization could achieve independently. Finally, we would operate with the same level of professional management and strategic planning that characterized successful business enterprises. The early years of building the Wellington Foundation were simultaneously exhilarating and exhausting, requiring me to master skills in strategic planning, financial management, program evaluation, and organizational leadership that weren't typically taught in social work programs. I was essentially inventing a new approach to philanthropic leadership, while simultaneously trying to implement it effectively. But the Foundation's early projects demonstrated that our approach could achieve results that were dramatically superior to traditional charitable methods. Our second major initiative focused on educational inequality in rural communities throughout Washington state, bringing together school districts, community colleges, technology companies, and local businesses to create comprehensive education and job training programs that could provide students with skills needed for modern employment opportunities. The Rural Education Initiative required coordinating with over 40 different organizations across 15 counties, developing curriculum that combined traditional academic subjects with practical job training, and creating partnerships with employers who would provide internships and eventual employment for program graduates. The complexity of managing such a large multi-stakeholder initiative required developing new systems for communication, coordination, and evaluation that could track progress across multiple sites and programs, while ensuring that all participants remained focused on shared goals rather than their individual organizational interests. But again, the results exceeded our most optimistic projections. Over 5 years, our Rural Education Initiative helped more than 3,000 students develop skills that led to employment opportunities, with average starting salaries that were 60% higher than what was available through traditional educational programs in their communities. More importantly, the initiative created sustainable partnerships between educational institutions and employers that continued to operate effectively even after our direct involvement ended, demonstrating that our approach could create lasting change rather than temporary improvements that disappeared when funding was withdrawn. The success of our early initiatives attracted attention from other philanthropists and foundation leaders throughout the country, who were interested in applying similar approaches to social problems in their own regions. By our 5th year of operation, the Wellington Foundation was receiving requests for consultation and collaboration from organizations in more than 20 states. But rather than simply expanding our geographical reach, I decided that our most important contribution would be developing and sharing the methodologies that made our approach effective, so that other organizations could apply similar principles to address social problems in their own communities. This decision led to the creation of the Thompson Institute for Philanthropic Innovation, a training and research center that would become one of the most influential institutions in the charitable sector. The institute offered intensive training programs for nonprofit leaders, foundation executives, and philanthropists who wanted to learn how to apply strategic thinking and outcome-focused approaches to charitable work. The institute also conducted research on effective charitable practices, published reports and case studies that shared successful methodologies with the broader nonprofit community, and provided consulting services to organizations that wanted to improve their effectiveness and impact. Within 10 years of its establishment, the Thompson Institute had trained over 5,000 nonprofit leaders and had consulted with more than 300 organizations throughout North America. The methodologies we had developed were being applied to address problems ranging from urban poverty to rural economic development to environmental conservation. But perhaps the most significant aspect of my work during this period was developing relationships with business leaders, government officials, and social innovators who shared our commitment to creating systemic change rather than simply managing social problems. These relationships created a network of influence and resources that could be mobilized to address large-scale challenges that required coordination between multiple sectors and stakeholders. The network included technology entrepreneurs who were interested in applying innovative approaches to social problems, government officials who wanted to improve the effectiveness of public programs, academic researchers who were developing new insights into the causes of social inequality, and philanthropists who were frustrated with traditional charitable approaches and were looking for more effective ways to create meaningful change. By the early 1990s, this network had evolved into what was essentially a shadow infrastructure for social innovation, connecting people and organizations across traditional boundaries and enabling collaboration on initiatives that would have been impossible within conventional institutional frameworks. The power and influence of this network became evident during our response to the economic recession of 1991-1992, when unemployment in the Pacific Northwest reached levels that threatened to overwhelm traditional social service systems. Rather than simply providing emergency assistance to people who had lost their jobs, we coordinated a comprehensive regional response that included job retraining programs, small business development initiatives, and infrastructure projects that created both immediate employment opportunities and long-term economic development. The Recession Response Initiative involved coordination between federal agencies, state and local governments, major corporations, educational institutions, and nonprofit organizations throughout Washington, Oregon, and Northern California. The scale and complexity of the coordination required was unprecedented in the charitable sector, but our network of relationships and our experience with large-scale collaborative projects made it possible to implement effectively. The results were remarkable both in terms of immediate impact and long-term consequences. Over 18 months, our Recession Response Initiative helped more than 12,000 people find new employment, created over 300 new small businesses, and generated economic development projects that continued to provide benefits to regional communities for decades afterward. More importantly, the success of the recession response demonstrated that our approach to philanthropic leadership could be applied to address major economic and social challenges that were typically considered beyond the scope of charitable organizations. We had essentially created a new model for civic leadership that could mobilize resources and coordinate action across traditional institutional boundaries. The recognition that followed the Recession Response Initiative established me as one of the most influential philanthropic leaders in the country. I received invitations to speak at major conferences, serve on advisory committees for federal agencies, and consult with other regions that were facing similar economic and social challenges. But rather than becoming a public figure who sought recognition and acclaim, I made the strategic decision to maintain a relatively low profile while continuing to build the institutional infrastructure and relationship networks that could create lasting change. I understood that sustainable social change required institutional capacity rather than individual celebrity, and I wanted to focus my energy on building systems that could continue to operate effectively regardless of any particular leader's involvement. This decision to prioritize institutional building over personal recognition would prove to be one of the most important strategic choices of my career, because it allowed me to continue developing innovative approaches to social problems without the constraints and distractions that typically accompanied public prominence in the nonprofit sector. During the 1990s and early 2000s, the Wellington Foundation and Thompson Institute continued to grow in both scope and influence, developing new approaches to addressing problems like educational inequality, economic development, environmental conservation, and healthcare access. But our most significant innovation during this period was the development of what we called venture philanthropy approaches that applied investment principles to charitable giving. Instead of simply providing grants to nonprofit organizations and hoping for positive outcomes, venture philanthropy involved making substantial, multi-year investments in organizations and initiatives that showed potential for creating significant social impact, and then providing ongoing support, consultation, and evaluation to maximize the effectiveness of those investments. This approach required developing expertise in areas like organizational development, strategic planning, financial management, and performance evaluation that went far beyond traditional grant-making practices. But it also produced results that were dramatically superior to conventional charitable approaches, because it ensured that funding was coupled with the management support and strategic guidance that nonprofit organizations needed to achieve their full potential. The venture philanthropy approach attracted significant attention from other foundations and philanthropists who were interested in maximizing the impact of their charitable giving. Within 5 years, we were managing venture philanthropy investments for more than 40 different donors, with total assets under management exceeding $200 million. But the most personally satisfying aspect of our venture philanthropy work was the opportunity to support innovative social entrepreneurs who were developing creative solutions to persistent problems, but who lacked access to the capital and expertise needed to scale their approaches effectively. One of our most successful venture philanthropy investments was in a young social worker named Patricia Chen, who had developed an innovative approach to preventing youth homelessness by providing comprehensive support services to families before they reached crisis points. Patricia's approach was showing promising results in pilot programs, but she lacked the resources and management expertise needed to expand her model to serve more families. Our venture philanthropy investment provided Patricia with 3 years of funding, plus access to management consulting, program evaluation, and strategic planning support that helped her organization grow from serving 50 families annually to serving over 800 families while maintaining the high-quality, personalized approach that made her model effective. More importantly, our support helped Patricia develop the institutional capacity and leadership skills that enabled her to continue growing her organization independently after our direct involvement ended. 10 years later, her organization was operating in 12 cities, and it helped more than 5,000 families avoid homelessness while building stable, independent lives. The success stories that emerged from our venture philanthropy work demonstrated that strategic, well-supported charitable investments could create social change that was both substantial and sustainable. But they also reinforced my belief that the most important contribution of philanthropic leadership was developing and supporting other leaders who could continue creating positive change throughout their careers. By 2005, the combined impact of the Wellington Foundation, Thompson Institute, and our venture philanthropy initiatives had fundamentally changed the landscape of charitable work throughout the Pacific Northwest. We had directly invested over $150 million in social change initiatives, but more importantly, we had helped develop methodologies and train leaders who were continuing to create positive impact through their own organizations and initiatives. The influence of our work extended far beyond the specific programs and organizations we had supported, because the principles and practices we had developed were being applied by hundreds of other organizations throughout the region and beyond. The collaborative, outcome-focused, strategic approach to charitable work that we had pioneered was becoming the standard for effective philanthropy rather than the exception. But perhaps the most significant measure of our impact was the change in how business leaders, government officials, and community leaders thought about addressing social problems. Instead of viewing charitable work as something separate from economic development, education policy, and community planning, leaders throughout the region had begun to understand that effective social change required coordination between multiple sectors and stakeholders. This shift in perspective had created new opportunities for addressing complex problems that required resources and expertise from multiple sources. Environmental conservation projects that combined business development with ecological protection. Educational initiatives that linked workforce development with economic growth. Housing projects that integrated social services with community development. The integrated, collaborative approach to social change that we had spent 25 years developing was becoming the foundation for a new model of civic leadership that could address the complex, interconnected challenges that characterized modern society. As I approached my 60th birthday in 2013, I began to transition from active leadership of the Wellington Foundation to a more advisory role that would allow me to focus on mentoring the next generation of philanthropic leaders while continuing to participate in major strategic initiatives. But rather than simply retiring from active involvement in charitable work, I wanted to use my accumulated expertise and relationships to address some of the most challenging social problems that remained resistant to conventional approaches. This led to the creation of the Thompson Legacy Initiative, which would focus on developing innovative solutions to systemic inequality, environmental sustainability, and economic justice. The Legacy Initiative represented the culmination of everything I had learned about effective philanthropic leadership over more than 30 years. Instead of creating another foundation or nonprofit organization, we developed a flexible network approach that could mobilize resources and coordinate action across institutional boundaries while adapting quickly to changing circumstances and emerging opportunities. The Legacy Initiative's first major project was developing a comprehensive approach to addressing climate change impacts on low-income communities throughout the Pacific Northwest. Climate change was creating new challenges for communities that were already struggling with economic inequality, and traditional environmental organizations weren't equipped to address the complex intersection of environmental and social justice issues. Our Climate Justice Initiative brought together environmental scientists, community organizers, economic development specialists, and policy advocates to develop integrated solutions that could address both environmental protection and economic opportunity simultaneously. The complexity of coordinating such diverse expertise and perspectives required all of the collaborative leadership skills I had developed over my entire career. But the results demonstrated that comprehensive, multi-sector approaches could achieve breakthroughs that weren't possible through traditional single-issue advocacy. Our Climate Justice Initiative helped more than 30 communities develop economic development strategies that were both environmentally sustainable and economically beneficial, creating over 2,000 jobs while reducing carbon emissions and improving environmental quality. By 2020, the combined impact of all the organizations and initiatives I had led or supported over nearly 40 years represented one of the most comprehensive and successful philanthropic careers in American history. We had directly invested over $400 million in social change initiatives, but more importantly, we had helped to develop the institutional capacity and leadership expertise that was continuing to create positive impact throughout the region and beyond. The methodologies we had pioneered were being taught in graduate programs at major universities. The organizations we had supported were continuing to grow and create positive change in their communities. The leaders we had mentored were developing new innovations and scaling successful approaches to address emerging challenges. But the most personally meaningful aspect of my philanthropic career was the knowledge that we had created lasting change in the lives of hundreds of thousands of people who had benefited from the programs, organizations, and initiatives we had supported. Children who had received better education and job training. Families who had avoided homelessness and built stable lives. Communities that had developed sustainable economic opportunities. This was the woman that Miranda had dismissed as just the janitor at the Wellington Foundation Gala. Someone who had spent 42 years building one of the most influential philanthropic empires in the country. Someone whose network of relationships included business leaders, government officials, and social innovators throughout the nation. Someone whose approval or disapproval could make or break careers and reputations in the charitable sector. Miranda had chosen to humiliate someone who had dedicated her entire adult life to helping others. Someone who understood power and influence at levels she couldn't even comprehend. Someone who had the resources and relationships to ensure that her cruelty would have consequences she never anticipated. The gentle, modest woman Miranda thought she could dismiss was actually one of the most powerful people in the room, and she was about to discover exactly what that power looked like when it was directed toward ensuring that someone faced appropriate consequences for their actions. The stage was set for a revelation that would destroy everything Miranda had worked to build, and I was going to enjoy every moment of her education about the real nature of power, influence, and justice. To understand why Miranda's humiliation of me at the Wellington Foundation Gala would result in such devastating consequences, you need to understand exactly who Miranda Rodriguez had become by the time she made her catastrophic mistake. Not the loving wife she pretended to be, but a calculating, narcissistic social climber whose obsession with status and wealth had transformed her into someone capable of extraordinary cruelty when she believed no one could stop her. Miranda Elena Rodriguez was born in March 1989 in Tacoma, Washington, the younger daughter of Roberto Rodriguez, a maintenance supervisor at a paper mill, and Elena Rodriguez, who worked part-time as a house cleaner for wealthy families in the affluent neighborhoods surrounding Puget Sound. From her earliest memories, Miranda's life had been defined by the stark contrast between her family's modest circumstances and the luxury she observed in the homes where her mother worked. While other children developed their understanding of success and happiness through their own family experiences, Miranda's worldview was shaped by weekly visits to mansions, where she would wait in kitchens and service areas while her mother cleaned bathrooms, organized closets, and maintained the pristine environments that represented everything Miranda believed she deserved but couldn't access. These early experiences created a psychological foundation that would define Miranda's entire approach to relationships, career choices, and personal values. Instead of developing appreciation for her parents' hard work and sacrifice, Miranda developed resentment toward their modest lifestyle and burning ambition to escape what she viewed as the humiliation of working-class existence. By middle school, Miranda had begun to construct elaborate fantasies about the life she would eventually create for herself, complete with luxury homes, expensive cars, designer clothing, and social connections that would elevate her far above the circumstances of her birth. But rather than developing realistic plans for achieving these goals through education, career development, or personal accomplishment, Miranda focused her energy on identifying shortcuts that could provide immediate access to wealth and status. The shortcut strategy that would define Miranda's entire adult life was her discovery that her natural beauty and social intelligence could be used to gain access to people and opportunities that would otherwise be beyond her reach. During high school, Miranda learned that wealthy classmates would include her in their social activities if she was entertaining enough, attractive enough, and careful never to remind them of the economic differences that separated their families. Miranda became expertly skilled at camouflaging her background and presenting herself as someone who belonged in affluent social circles. She would study fashion magazines to learn about luxury brands, practice conversation techniques that projected sophistication, and develop personas that could adapt to whatever image seemed most likely to impress the people she wanted to cultivate as friends and connections. But perhaps the most important skill Miranda developed during this period was her ability to identify and exploit other people's insecurities, weaknesses, and desires. She understood intuitively that people were more likely to include her in their social circles if she could make them feel more attractive, more interesting, or more important than they actually were. Miranda's approach to relationships during high school and college was fundamentally transactional, based on careful calculation of what each person could provide for her advancement, rather than genuine affection or compatibility. She would maintain friendships with people who could introduce her to more interesting connections, date young men who could provide access to better social events, and participate in activities that would enhance her reputation and expand her network of useful relationships. This strategic approach to social connections continued through Miranda's college years at Washington State University, where she majored in communications with a minor in business administration, academic choices that reflected her focus on developing skills that would be useful for manipulating social dynamics rather than building expertise in any particular field. Miranda's college experience was primarily devoted to perfecting her ability to project sophistication and desirability, while concealing the calculated nature of her approach to relationships. She learned to present herself as spontaneous and genuine, while actually planning every interaction to maximize her advantage and minimize any risks to her carefully constructed image. During her senior year, Miranda had begun to focus specifically on identifying potential marriage partners who could provide the financial security and social status that she had been seeking since childhood. She understood that her window of opportunity was limited. Her beauty and youth were assets that would diminish over time, and she needed to convert them into permanent security before they lost their value. Miranda's strategy for finding a wealthy husband was sophisticated and methodical. She would research the backgrounds of potential partners, analyzing their family wealth, career prospects, and social connections, to determine which relationships were worth pursuing seriously. She would attend events and activities where she was likely to meet successful men, and she would present different versions of herself, depending on what seemed most likely to appeal to each individual target. The approach required Miranda to become expertly skilled at deception and manipulation, but she justified these techniques as necessary tools for achieving the security and status that she believed she deserved. In Miranda's worldview, using her beauty and social skills to marry into wealth was simply a more efficient career strategy than the decades of education and hard work that would be required to achieve similar financial outcomes through professional accomplishment. When Miranda met David Thompson at the Children's Hospital benefit dinner in 2019, she recognized immediately that he represented exactly the kind of opportunity she had been preparing for throughout her 20s. David was handsome, successful, and obviously wealthy enough to attend expensive charity events. More importantly, he seemed genuinely interested in her, and appeared to be the kind of person who would value the supportive, sophisticated partnership that Miranda had learned to project. Miranda's courtship strategy with David was her most sophisticated performance to date, requiring her to maintain a complex persona that projected independence and success while actually being completely dependent on his continued interest and approval. She presented herself as someone who was financially stable and professionally accomplished, when in reality she was working temporary event coordination jobs and living in a small apartment with 2 roommates. The deception required Miranda to develop elaborate explanations for her lifestyle choices, career decisions, and financial situation that would make her modest circumstances seem like deliberate preferences, rather than economic limitations. She claimed to prefer authentic experiences over luxury, meaningful work over high-paying careers, and genuine relationships over materialistic considerations. These explanations were carefully crafted to appeal to David's values and insecurities, while concealing Miranda's true motivations and priorities. David, who was genuinely successful but sometimes felt guilty about his privileged background, was attracted to Miranda's apparent authenticity and her seeming indifference to material wealth. But beneath Miranda's carefully constructed performance, she was conducting detailed research into David's financial situation, family background, and long-term earning potential. She learned about his career trajectory at Patterson & Associates, analyzed his investment portfolio through casual conversations about financial planning, and even researched his family's wealth and social connections to determine whether marriage to David would provide the security and status she was seeking. Miranda's investigation revealed that David was financially comfortable but not extraordinarily wealthy, earning approximately $200,000 annually, with assets totaling less than $1 million. While this represented substantial success by most standards, it wasn't the kind of generational wealth that Miranda had hoped to access through marriage. But Miranda's research had also revealed that David was the only son of Margaret Thompson, and Miranda's attempts to investigate my background had yielded confusing results that suggested either hidden wealth or family secrets that might be worth exploring. The contradiction between my modest lifestyle and my apparent community involvement created questions that Miranda couldn't answer through superficial research. Rather than investigating further or asking direct questions about my background, Miranda had simply assumed that any wealth or influence I might possess was probably minimal and outdated. She convinced herself that David's comfortable income and professional prospects were sufficient to provide the lifestyle she wanted, especially if she could help him advance his career through strategic social connections and ambitious goal setting. Miranda's decision to marry David, despite his limited wealth, reflected her growing desperation to secure her financial future before her physical attractiveness began to decline. She was approaching 30 years old and understood that her opportunities for marrying into substantial wealth were becoming more limited as younger, more beautiful women entered the competition for successful men. The wedding planning process revealed the first clear indication of Miranda's true character and priorities to people who were observant enough to notice the disconnect between her stated values and her actual behavior. While Miranda claimed to value authenticity and meaningful relationships, she planned an elaborate, expensive wedding that was designed primarily to establish her social status and create publicity that would enhance her reputation. Miranda's vision for their wedding was a 300-guest extravaganza that would cost over $70,000 and would include every detail necessary to create the impression of wealth, sophistication, and social importance. She wanted designer flowers, premium catering, professional photography, and entertainment that would generate the kind of talking points that would establish her position in Seattle's social hierarchy. The expense of Miranda's wedding plans created significant financial stress for David, who was forced to liquidate investments, borrow against his retirement savings, and take on debt that would require years to repay. But Miranda dismissed his concerns about the cost, arguing that the wedding was an investment in their future social and professional success rather than an unnecessary expense. "David, you need to understand that this wedding is about more than just one day," Miranda explained during their planning discussions. "It's about establishing our reputation and showing people that we're serious about building something important together. If we have some cheap, modest wedding, people will assume we're not successful or ambitious." The phrase "establishing our reputation" was particularly revealing because it demonstrated that Miranda viewed their marriage as a business venture rather than a romantic relationship. She was using their wedding as a marketing event designed to launch her social climbing career rather than as a celebration of their love and commitment to each other. But David, who was genuinely in love and wanted to make Miranda happy, ultimately agreed to the expensive wedding she demanded. The event was beautiful and successful in achieving Miranda's goal of creating an impressive social debut, but the financial aftermath revealed the fundamental problems with Miranda's approach to money and relationships. The $70,000 wedding had consumed most of David's liquid assets and created debt that would constrain their lifestyle for years to come. But rather than acknowledging the financial burden her demands had created, Miranda immediately began planning for the next phase of her social advancement, which involved upgrading their living situation, expanding their social activities, and maintaining the lifestyle that would reinforce the impression of success she had created through their wedding. Miranda's post-wedding behavior revealed that her expensive wedding had been just the beginning of her plans for using David's income to fund her social climbing ambitions. She wanted to move to a larger apartment in a more prestigious neighborhood, purchase luxury furniture and accessories that would impress guests, and maintain a social calendar that included regular attendance at expensive restaurants, cultural events, and charity galas. The financial pressure created by Miranda's lifestyle demands began to affect David's work performance and personal well-being. He was working longer hours to generate additional income while also trying to maintain the social schedule that Miranda considered essential for their advancement. The stress was creating problems in their marriage that Miranda blamed on David's lack of ambition rather than her own unrealistic expectations. "David, I don't understand why you're not more focused on advancing your career," Miranda complained during one of their discussions about money. "You're talented and capable, but you're not doing anything to distinguish yourself or move to the next level. I need to know that you're committed to building something significant." Miranda's pressure for David to earn more money revealed her fundamental misunderstanding of how professional advancement actually worked. She assumed that success was simply a matter of ambition and effort, and that David could increase his income substantially through more aggressive career strategies and networking activities. But Miranda's demands for lifestyle upgrades and social activities were actually interfering with David's ability to focus on his career advancement. The debt created by their wedding and the ongoing expenses of maintaining Miranda's preferred lifestyle were creating financial stress that affected his work performance and professional relationships. More problematically, Miranda's approach to social networking was alienating people who might have been valuable professional contacts for David. Her obvious focus on status and wealth made experienced business leaders and potential mentors uncomfortable, because they could recognize that her interest in them was purely transactional rather than genuine. Miranda's failure to gain acceptance among serious business leaders and social influencers frustrated her advancement goals and contributed to her increasing criticism of David's professional performance. She began to blame their limited social progress on David's lack of ambition, rather than recognizing that her own behavior was creating obstacles to the relationship she was trying to build. This pattern of blaming external factors for her failures, while refusing to acknowledge her own role in creating problems, would become characteristic of Miranda's approach to all the challenges and disappointments she encountered throughout her marriage. Instead of examining her own behavior and adjusting her strategies, Miranda would find ways to blame other people for interfering with her goals. My relationship with Miranda became a particular source of frustration because she couldn't determine whether I was an asset or liability for her social advancement plans. My apparent working-class background suggested that I might be embarrassing in social situations, but my obvious importance to David meant that she couldn't simply eliminate me from their lives without creating marriage problems. Miranda's solution was to try to manage my involvement in their social activities, minimizing my presence during important events, while maintaining the appearance of family harmony that David expected. She would invite me to family gatherings but control the guest lists to avoid mixing me with people she was trying to impress. She would include me in family photographs but carefully edit the images she shared on social media. Miranda's treatment of me during social events revealed her complete lack of empathy and her inability to value people who couldn't advance her personal goals. She would speak to me in condescending tones that implied I was too old or unsophisticated to understand modern social dynamics. She would explain basic concepts as if I couldn't possibly be familiar with contemporary culture or current events. Most insulting was Miranda's obvious relief when family gatherings ended, and she no longer had to manage the social awkwardness that she believed my presence created. She would make comments to David about how well events had gone, with subtle implications that success was measured partly by how effectively she had minimized any potential embarrassment. "I think everyone had a wonderful time tonight," Miranda would tell David after dinner parties, "and your mother seemed to really enjoy meeting everyone." The phrasing suggested that my enjoyment was something Miranda had generously facilitated, rather than a natural result of family hospitality. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of Miranda's character was her complete lack of genuine interest in charitable work, despite her regular attendance at fundraising events and charity galas. Miranda viewed these events purely as networking opportunities rather than expressions of concern for the causes being supported. Miranda would spend hundreds of dollars on tickets to charity events and would research guest lists to identify people she hoped to meet and cultivate as social connections. But she rarely made meaningful donations to the organizations hosting the events. And she never participated in volunteer activities or ongoing charitable work that would have demonstrated authentic commitment to helping others. This superficial approach to charitable involvement was immediately obvious to experienced philanthropists and community leaders who could distinguish between people who were genuinely committed to charitable causes and those who were using charity events for social advancement. Miranda's behavior at these events had marked her as someone whose motivations were selfish rather than altruistic. The established members of the charitable community had politely tolerated Miranda's presence at events, but had never welcomed her into their inner circles or invited her to participate in more exclusive activities. They had correctly identified her as someone whose interest in charitable work was purely transactional. Miranda's failure to gain acceptance among serious philanthropists had become a source of increasing frustration and resentment. She blamed her lack of progress on various external factors: David's limited income, my apparent working-class background, the cliquish nature of Seattle's charitable community, rather than recognizing that her superficial approach and obvious self-interest were preventing her from building authentic relationships. This frustration had made Miranda increasingly desperate to establish herself as someone worthy of inclusion in elite social circles. She had begun to take more aggressive approaches to social climbing, including making critical comments about other people's clothing, backgrounds, or behavior in attempts to position herself as someone with sophisticated standards and refined taste. Miranda's increasing desperation and aggression had made her more willing to take social risks that might have seemed unthinkable during her more cautious early years of marriage. She was becoming more critical of people she considered beneath her aspirations, more demanding of special treatment from service workers, and more willing to make public displays of what she considered her superior social status. The combination of financial stress, social frustration, and mounting desperation had transformed Miranda from someone who had once been capable of at least projecting kindness and consideration into someone whose true character was increasingly visible to anyone who observed her behavior carefully. Miranda's treatment of restaurant servers, retail employees, and other service workers had become particularly revealing. She would speak to them in demanding tones that implied they were personally responsible for any inconvenience or delay. She would make comments about their competence or intelligence when she believed they weren't providing adequate service. She would tip poorly and complain about service quality in ways that seemed designed to demonstrate her belief that she deserved better treatment. This pattern of treating service workers poorly was especially significant because it revealed Miranda's true character when she believed she was dealing with people who couldn't challenge her behavior or affect her social standing. The kindness and consideration she projected toward wealthy social contacts disappeared completely when she was interacting with people she considered powerless. The charitable community had begun to notice Miranda's treatment of event staff, hotel employees, and service workers during fundraising galas and social gatherings. Her behavior toward people she considered beneath her social aspirations was creating a reputation for arrogance and entitlement that was damaging her prospects for social advancement, even among people who might otherwise have been willing to include her in their activities. But Miranda was so focused on impressing people she considered important that she was completely oblivious to how her treatment of service workers was affecting her reputation among the very people she was trying to cultivate as friends and connections. She didn't understand that experienced philanthropists and community leaders often evaluated people's character based on how they treated those who couldn't provide anything in return. The Wellington Foundation Gala would provide Miranda with the perfect opportunity to demonstrate her true character to exactly the people she had been trying to impress for years. Her decision to humiliate someone she assumed was, quote, just the janitor, would reveal everything that serious philanthropists needed to know about her values, priorities, and fundamental approach to relationships. Miranda thought she was making a small social correction that would demonstrate her understanding of appropriate social boundaries. What she was actually doing was exposing her complete lack of empathy, respect, and basic human decency to a room full of people whose approval she had been desperately seeking for 3 years. The woman Miranda chose to humiliate was someone who understood exactly how power and influence actually worked in the charitable community. Someone who had spent decades building relationships with every important person in the room. Someone who could destroy Miranda's social aspirations with a single conversation. But more importantly, Miranda's public cruelty towards someone she considered powerless would demonstrate to everyone present exactly what kind of person she really was, beneath her carefully constructed facade of sophistication and social awareness. The stage was set for Miranda to reveal her true character to exactly the people who mattered most for her social goals, and the revelation would be devastating, permanent, and completely deserved. Justice was coming for someone who had spent years treating others with cruelty and contempt, and it was going to be delivered by someone who understood exactly how to ensure that Miranda's behavior would have consequences she could never escape. To understand the complete devastation that awaited Miranda after her catastrophic mistake at the Wellington Foundation Gala, you need to understand the full scope of resources, connections, and influence that Margaret Thompson had accumulated over 4 decades of philanthropic leadership, because the woman Miranda dismissed as just the janitor controlled an empire of wealth, power, and social influence that could destroy lives with the precision of a surgical strike. The financial foundation of my hidden empire began with a simple but profound realization I had made in 1985 during my early years at the Wellington Foundation. The most effective philanthropists weren't just people who gave away money, but people who understood how to make money grow strategically so that their charitable impact could expand exponentially over time. While most nonprofit leaders focused exclusively on program management and fundraising, I had taught myself the principles of investment management, tax optimization, and wealth building that would allow me to create sustainable funding sources for charitable work rather than simply managing annual donation cycles. My first major breakthrough came when I convinced Harrison Wellington to allow the foundation to invest a portion of our endowment in early-stage technology companies that were developing innovations with potential social impact. This was a radical departure from the conservative investment strategies that most foundations used, but I had identified an opportunity to generate superior returns while also supporting entrepreneurs who were working on solutions to social problems. The technology investment strategy proved to be extraordinarily successful, generating annual returns that averaged over 20% during the 1990s and early 2000s. But more importantly, it provided me with direct access to some of the most innovative and successful entrepreneurs in the Pacific Northwest, creating relationships that would become invaluable for both philanthropic work and personal wealth building. One of our most successful early investments was in a small software company called DataBridge Solutions, founded by a young programmer named Michael Chen who was developing database management systems for nonprofit organizations. Michael's technology had the potential to revolutionize how charitable organizations tracked their programs and measured their impact. But he needed capital and strategic guidance to scale his company effectively. Our investment in DataBridge Solutions provided Michael with the funding he needed, while also giving the Wellington Foundation access to cutting-edge technology that improved our own operational efficiency. But the real breakthrough came when Michael's database management systems proved to be valuable for commercial applications, as well as nonprofit organizations. Within 5 years, DataBridge Solutions had grown from a 3-person startup to a major technology company with over 200 employees and annual revenues exceeding $50 million. When Microsoft acquired DataBridge Solutions in 2001 for $400 million, the Wellington Foundation's initial investment of $200,000 had grown to a value of over $8 million. But the Microsoft acquisition was just the beginning of the opportunities that emerged from our technology investment strategy. The success of DataBridge Solutions attracted attention from other entrepreneurs who were developing innovative solutions to social problems, and the Wellington Foundation became known as one of the most sophisticated and successful impact investors in the region. Over the next 2 decades, our impact investment portfolio included early-stage investments in companies that developed renewable energy technologies, healthcare innovations, educational software, and environmental remediation systems. The combined value of these investments grew to exceed $200 million by 2020, making the Wellington Foundation one of the wealthiest charitable organizations in the Pacific Northwest. But the financial success of our investment strategy was only one component of the resource empire I had built over 4 decades of philanthropic leadership. The relationships and connections that emerged from our work created a network of influence that extended throughout the business, political, and social leadership communities of the entire region. The network included technology entrepreneurs who had built billion-dollar companies with our early-stage support, and who remained personally grateful for the role we had played in their success. Government officials who had worked with us on major policy initiatives, and who valued our expertise in addressing complex social problems. Business leaders who had participated in our collaborative projects, and who understood the strategic value of our approach to community development. Perhaps most importantly, the network included hundreds of other philanthropists, foundation leaders, and social innovators who had learned from our methodologies and who considered me a mentor and strategic advisor for their own charitable work. These relationships created a web of mutual support and collaboration that could be mobilized to address major challenges, or, when necessary, to respond to threats to the values and principles that we all shared. The power of this network became evident during our response to the 2008 financial crisis, when traditional funding sources for charitable work were severely constrained, and many nonprofit organizations were facing existential threats to their survival. Rather than simply reducing our own charitable activities, we coordinated a comprehensive regional response that mobilized resources from multiple sources to maintain essential services, while also creating new economic opportunities. The Crisis Response Initiative involved coordination between the Wellington Foundation, 12 other major foundations, over 30 business leaders, and government officials at the federal, state, and local levels. The scale and complexity of the coordination required was unprecedented, but our network of relationships and our experience with large-scale collaborative projects made it possible to implement effectively. The financial resources we mobilized for the crisis response exceeded $100 million, but more importantly, we created institutional capacity that continued to operate long after the immediate crisis had passed. New partnerships between business and nonprofit organizations, innovative funding mechanisms that reduced dependence on traditional charitable sources, policy changes that improved the regulatory environment for social entrepreneurship. But perhaps the most significant aspect of the crisis response was the demonstration of how quickly and effectively our network could mobilize to address major challenges. The speed and coordination of our response impressed business leaders, government officials, and community leaders throughout the region, establishing our network as the de facto leadership infrastructure for addressing complex regional problems. This reputation for effective leadership created opportunities to influence policy decisions, business strategies, and community development initiatives at levels that most individual philanthropists could never access. Government agencies would consult with us before implementing major policy changes that might affect nonprofit organizations. Business leaders would seek our input on corporate social responsibility strategies. Community leaders would request our participation in planning processes for major development projects. The influence that emerged from our network relationships was both subtle and powerful, operating through informal conversations, strategic recommendations, and collaborative initiatives, rather than through formal political or economic mechanisms. But the cumulative effect was to create a level of impact on regional decision-making that far exceeded what could have been achieved through traditional charitable giving alone. By 2015, our network had evolved into what was essentially a shadow governance system for addressing social and economic challenges throughout the Pacific Northwest. When major problems emerged, environmental crises, economic disruptions, social conflicts, our network would coordinate responses that combined public and private resources, regulatory and market-based solutions, and short-term relief with long-term strategic change. The shadow governance system operated through regular informal gatherings of network members, strategic planning sessions that brought together leaders from different sectors, and communication channels that allowed rapid coordination when immediate responses were needed. The system was effective precisely because it was informal and voluntary, based on relationships of trust and mutual respect rather than formal authority or legal obligations. But the most important resource I had accumulated over 4 decades of philanthropic leadership wasn't financial wealth or political influence, it was information. The comprehensive understanding of how power actually operated in our region, who made the decisions that mattered, and what motivations and pressures influenced their choices. This information came from decades of working closely with business leaders, government officials, and community leaders on projects that revealed their true priorities, capabilities, and character. I had observed how they responded to crises, how they treated people who couldn't help their careers, and how they balanced public interests against personal advantages. The information also came from the extensive due diligence processes we used for our impact investments and charitable grants, which required comprehensive analysis of organizations, leaders, and market conditions that provided detailed insights into regional economic and social dynamics. Most importantly, the information came from my deliberate strategy of maintaining a modest public profile while building extensive private relationships with people throughout the region. Because I wasn't viewed as a competitor or threat, people were willing to share information, concerns, and strategic plans that they would never have revealed to someone they considered a rival or potential adversary. The combination of financial resources, network relationships, and comprehensive information created capabilities that were far beyond what most people understood about philanthropic leadership. I could analyze complex problems from multiple perspectives, mobilize resources from diverse sources, and coordinate responses that addressed root causes rather than just symptoms. But perhaps the most powerful aspect of my resource empire was the moral authority that came from 4 decades of consistent commitment to helping others and addressing social problems. The authenticity of my charitable work and the measurable impact of our initiatives had created a reputation for integrity and effectiveness that provided extraordinary influence in situations where character and credibility mattered more than wealth or formal authority. This moral authority meant that when I expressed concerns about someone's behavior or character, people throughout our network took those concerns seriously. When I recommended someone for opportunities or support, those recommendations carried weight that could make or break careers. When I suggested that someone's actions were harmful to community interests, those suggestions could result in social and professional consequences that were swift and severe. The moral authority also meant that my personal values and priorities influenced the culture and decision-making processes throughout our network. The emphasis on collaboration, outcome measurement, and authentic commitment to helping others had become standard expectations for anyone who wanted to participate in our initiatives or gain access to our resources. These cultural standards created an environment where behavior like Miranda's treatment of service workers and her superficial approach to charitable work were immediately recognizable as incompatible with our network's values and expectations. People who demonstrated genuine commitment to helping others were welcomed and supported. People who were obviously focused on personal advancement were excluded and marginalized. The financial resources that supported my philanthropic work were far more substantial than anyone outside our inner circle understood. In addition to the Wellington Foundation's endowment of over $300 million, I had accumulated personal assets that exceeded $50 million through strategic investments, real estate holdings, and business ventures that had emerged from our philanthropic activities. My personal investment portfolio included substantial holdings in technology companies, renewable energy projects, and real estate developments throughout the Pacific Northwest. But unlike conventional wealth accumulation strategies, my investments were chosen specifically to support companies and projects that created positive social impact while also generating financial returns. The real estate holdings were particularly valuable, including properties in Seattle, Portland, and other major regional cities that had appreciated dramatically over the past 2 decades. But more importantly, many of these properties were used to support nonprofit organizations and social enterprises that needed affordable space for their operations. My primary residence was the modest house where Miranda had visited for family gatherings, but I also owned a waterfront property on Puget Sound that was used for foundation retreats and strategic planning sessions, a downtown Seattle condominium that served as my office space for foundation work, and several properties that were leased to nonprofit organizations at below-market rates. The business ventures that had emerged from our philanthropic work included consulting services, training programs, and technology platforms that generated substantial ongoing revenue, while also supporting the charitable work of other organizations. These ventures provided both financial resources and strategic capabilities that enhanced our impact while reducing dependence on traditional fundraising. But perhaps the most valuable business asset was the Thompson Institute for Philanthropic Innovation, which had grown from a training program into a comprehensive research and consulting organization that worked with foundations, corporations, and government agencies throughout North America. The Institute's client base included some of the largest foundations in the country, major corporations that were developing corporate social responsibility strategies, and government agencies that needed expertise in addressing complex social problems. The consulting revenues generated by the Institute exceeded $10 million annually and provided access to decision-makers and strategic information throughout the philanthropic sector. The combination of these various financial resources meant that I had the capability to make substantial investments in charitable projects, business ventures, or strategic initiatives without requiring approval from boards, donors, or other stakeholders. The financial independence provided extraordinary flexibility to respond quickly to opportunities or challenges that required immediate action. But more importantly, the financial resources provided the security and confidence that allowed me to take risks and make decisions based on principles rather than self-interest. I could afford to alienate people who disagreed with my values because I didn't depend on their approval or support for my financial security. This financial independence was particularly important when dealing with people like Miranda, whose behavior violated the values and standards that were central to our network's culture. I could afford to respond forcefully to her cruelty because I didn't need to worry about how my response might affect my career, social standing, or financial security. The technological resources that supported my work were far more sophisticated than anyone would have expected from someone who appeared to be a modest elderly woman with limited technical skills. My home office was equipped with state-of-the-art computer systems, secure communication equipment, and comprehensive databases that contained detailed information about organizations, individuals, and strategic relationships throughout the region. The computer systems included specialized software for financial analysis, project management, and strategic planning that allowed me to analyze complex problems and coordinate multi-stakeholder initiatives with professional-level efficiency and accuracy. The communication equipment provided secure channels for sensitive conversations and confidential information sharing that were essential for network coordination and strategic planning. The databases contained comprehensive profiles of thousands of individuals and organizations throughout the Pacific Northwest, including detailed information about their backgrounds, capabilities, financial situations, and strategic relationships. This information was essential for due diligence processes, strategic planning, and risk assessment for potential investments and partnerships. But perhaps the most powerful technological resource was the comprehensive monitoring and analysis system that allowed me to track developments throughout the region that might affect our work or create opportunities for positive impact. The system included automated news analysis, social media monitoring, and financial market surveillance that provided early warning about emerging issues and trends. The monitoring system had been tracking Miranda's social media activities, public statements, and social behavior for over 2 years, documenting the pattern of superficial charitable involvement and condescending treatment of service workers that had marked her as someone whose values were incompatible with authentic philanthropic work. When Miranda made her catastrophic mistake at the Wellington Foundation Gala, the monitoring system would capture and analyze every aspect of the incident, providing comprehensive documentation that could be used to ensure that her behavior had appropriate consequences throughout our network and beyond. The legal resources available to me were equally sophisticated and powerful. Over 4 decades of philanthropic work, I had developed relationships with some of the most capable attorneys in the region, specializing in areas ranging from nonprofit law to corporate governance to civil rights advocacy. These relationships provided access to legal expertise and representation that could address any challenges or conflicts that might arise from my philanthropic work or personal activities. But more importantly, the attorneys in our network shared our commitment to social justice and community service, and they were willing to donate their time and expertise to address situations where legal action might be necessary to protect community interests. The legal network included attorneys who specialized in employment law, civil rights law, and nonprofit governance, who could provide immediate support if Miranda's behavior at the gala created legal issues that needed to be addressed. But it also included attorneys who specialized in defamation law, contract law, and business litigation, who could ensure that Miranda faced appropriate legal consequences for any actions that violated legal standards or contractual obligations. Perhaps most importantly, the legal network included former federal prosecutors and judges who understood how to navigate complex legal situations that involved multiple jurisdictions, competing interests, and sensitive political considerations. Their expertise would be invaluable if Miranda's behavior required responses that involved coordination between different legal systems or institutions. The media relationships that I had cultivated over 4 decades of philanthropic leadership provided another powerful resource for ensuring that Miranda's behavior would have appropriate consequences. The network included journalists, editors, and media executives who understood the importance of authentic charitable work and who were committed to exposing people who exploited charitable activities for personal advancement. These media relationships had been built through decades of providing reliable information, exclusive access, and strategic insights that helped journalists understand complex social issues and community developments. The relationships were based on mutual respect and shared commitment to informing the public about important community issues. When Miranda's behavior at the gala needed to be exposed to the broader community, the media network would ensure that the story received appropriate coverage and analysis that would help the public understand the importance of authenticity and respect in charitable work. But perhaps the most powerful resource of all was the moral clarity that came from 4 decades of authentic commitment to helping others. I understood exactly what Miranda had done wrong, why it mattered, and what consequences would be appropriate to ensure that her behavior was corrected, and that other people understood the importance of treating everyone with dignity and respect. The combination of financial resources, network relationships, technological capabilities, legal expertise, media connections, and moral authority created a comprehensive system for ensuring that people who violated community values faced appropriate consequences for their actions. Miranda had chosen to humiliate someone who controlled resources and capabilities that she couldn't even imagine, someone who understood exactly how to ensure that her cruelty would result in consequences that were both swift and permanent. The woman Miranda thought she could dismiss as just the janitor was about to demonstrate exactly what justice looked like when it was delivered by someone who had spent 4 decades building the resources and relationships necessary to protect community values and ensure that people who hurt others faced appropriate consequences for their actions. The stage was set for Miranda to discover that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who looks like they couldn't possibly hurt you, and the lesson was going to be comprehensive, devastating, and unforgettable. The evening of November 12, 2023, started like any other charity gala in Seattle's social calendar, with no indication that by midnight, one of the city's most ambitious social climbers would be in complete disgrace, and her entire carefully constructed life would be destroyed by consequences she never saw coming. But every detail of what happened that night, from Miranda's calculated cruelty to my moment of revelation to the swift and devastating justice that followed, needs to be understood completely, because this wasn't just a story about social humiliation. This was a masterclass in what happens when someone fundamentally underestimates their victim and discovers too late that some people are far more dangerous than they appear. The Wellington Foundation's 40th anniversary gala was being held at the Four Seasons Hotel in downtown Seattle, the same venue where Miranda had held her expensive wedding 3 years earlier. The event was expected to be the most prestigious charitable gathering of the year, with over 500 guests including business leaders, politicians, celebrities, and philanthropists who collectively controlled billions of dollars in charitable funding and social influence. But this wasn't just another fundraising event. It was specifically designed to honor my 4 decades of philanthropic leadership and to announce the largest charitable donation in the foundation's history. The evening's program included tributes from governors, senators, and CEOs, along with a keynote address that I would deliver about the future of strategic philanthropy. The irony was that Miranda had been trying to gain access to exactly this kind of high-profile charity event for years, and her marriage to David had finally provided the invitation she had been desperately seeking. But instead of recognizing the opportunity to observe and learn from authentic philanthropic leadership, Miranda viewed the gala as another networking opportunity for her social climbing ambitions. I had arrived at the Four Seasons that afternoon to oversee the final preparations for the event, wearing my simple navy blue dress and comfortable shoes, carrying my modest canvas bag, and moving through the elegant spaces with the quiet efficiency that had fooled so many people over the years. To anyone who didn't know better, I appeared to be exactly what Miranda would assume I was, a member of the hotel's housekeeping staff preparing for another wealthy people's party. The hotel staff, of course, knew exactly who I was. The Four Seasons had been hosting Wellington Foundation events for over 15 years, and their employees understood that the modest elderly woman directing the setup was actually the guest of honor, who had made their careers possible through decades of charitable work that had supported hospitality industry training programs throughout the region. "Good afternoon, Miss Thompson," whispered James Martinez, the hotel's general manager, as I checked the arrangements for the silent auction displays. "Everything is proceeding perfectly for this evening. The kitchen staff wanted me to tell you how honored they are to be preparing dinner for someone who has done so much for our community." Quote. James's respectful greeting was typical of how people who understood the charitable community treated me, but it was exactly the kind of deference that would have shocked Miranda if she had witnessed it. In her worldview, elderly women in simple dresses didn't receive respectful treatment from luxury hotel managers. The early evening reception began at 6 o'clock, with guests arriving in designer gowns and tailored tuxedos, ready to participate in the kind of elegant social gathering that represented the pinnacle of Seattle's charitable community. The reception area was filled with the subdued conversations and refined laughter that characterized high-level philanthropic events, where serious people discussed important work in beautiful settings. Miranda and David arrived precisely at 6:30, timed to ensure that they would be seen by the maximum number of important guests while avoiding the awkwardness of being among the first to arrive. Miranda was wearing a stunning emerald green gown that had cost over $3,000, paired with jewelry that David had purchased specifically for the occasion despite their ongoing financial constraints. Miranda's strategy for the evening was to focus on meeting and impressing the most influential guests while demonstrating her sophistication and knowledge of charitable work. She had researched the guest list extensively, identifying business leaders, foundation executives, and social influencers who might be valuable contacts for her future social advancement. But Miranda's approach to the reception revealed immediately that she had learned nothing from her previous failures to gain acceptance among serious philanthropists. She moved through the crowd with obvious calculation, targeting people based on their apparent wealth and importance rather than engaging in the kind of authentic conversations that characterize genuine charitable commitment. I observed Miranda's behavior from across the reception area, noting how she would interrupt conversations to introduce herself to people she considered important, while ignoring or dismissing people she assumed were less valuable for her social goals. Her approach was so transparent that experienced philanthropists could immediately recognize her as someone whose interest in charitable work was purely transactional. The most telling moment came when Miranda encountered Eleanor Washington, the founder of the Pacific Northwest Education Foundation and one of the most respected philanthropists in the region. Eleanor was a brilliant woman who had built her foundation through decades of innovative work in educational equity. But she was also someone who dressed modestly and spoke quietly, making her easy to overlook for people who judged importance based on superficial markers. Miranda approached Eleanor with a kind of artificial enthusiasm that immediately identified her as someone who was networking rather than genuinely interested in conversation. "Hello, I'm Miranda Thompson," she announced, using David's last name in a way that suggested she expected it to be recognized as significant. "I don't believe we've met, but I'm very involved in charitable work in the community." Eleanor's response was polite but distant, reflecting the kind of reserved friendliness that experienced philanthropists used with people whose motivations were questionable. "It's nice to meet you, Miranda. What kind of charitable work are you involved in?" Miranda's answer revealed everything that serious philanthropists needed to know about her approach to charitable involvement. "Oh, I attend a lot of events like this one," she said with a laugh that suggested she found the question amusing. "I'm very committed to supporting important causes, especially when they provide opportunities to meet people who are making a real difference in the community." The phrase, "especially when they provide opportunities to meet people," was exactly the kind of honest mistake that exposed Miranda's true motivations to someone as experienced as Eleanor. Authentic philanthropists talked about the causes they supported and the impact they hoped to create. Social climbers talked about the networking opportunities that charitable events provided. Eleanor's expression shifted subtly in response to Miranda's revelation, moving from polite interest to the kind of careful neutrality that indicated she had identified Miranda as someone whose presence at charitable events was motivated by social climbing rather than genuine commitment to helping others. "I see," Eleanor said simply before politely excusing herself to join a conversation with other guests who were discussing the actual charitable work being celebrated that evening. Miranda's failure to engage meaningfully with Eleanor was typical of her interactions throughout the reception. She would approach influential guests with obvious calculation, make superficial comments about their work or reputation, and then reveal through her questions and responses that she had no genuine understanding of or interest in the charitable causes that were supposedly bringing everyone together. The established members of the charitable community responded to Miranda's approach with the kind of polite dismissal that they had perfected for dealing with people who attended charity events for social reasons, rather than charitable ones. They were consistently courteous but never welcoming, maintaining the kind of professional distance that prevented Miranda from accessing the inner circles she was so desperately trying to join. As the evening progressed toward the formal dinner program, Miranda's frustration with her lack of social success had become increasingly evident. She had been unable to establish meaningful connections with any of the influential guests she had targeted, and she was beginning to realize that her carefully planned networking strategy was failing spectacularly. The dinner program featured a series of tributes to my philanthropic work, with speakers including Governor Patricia Williams, Senator Michael Chen, and Harrison Wellington III, the son of the foundation's original founder. Each speaker described specific aspects of my contributions to the community, providing detailed examples of programs, initiatives, and innovations that had created lasting positive change throughout the region. Miranda's response to these tributes revealed her complete disconnect from the authentic charitable work being celebrated. Instead of listening to the speakers and learning about the impact of strategic philanthropy, she was focused on identifying and evaluating the other guests, making notes about people she hoped to approach during the networking reception that would follow dinner. The irony was that Miranda was attending an event specifically designed to honor someone whose approach to charitable work represented everything she claimed to value: innovation, impact, and authentic commitment to helping others. But her obsession with social climbing had prevented her from recognizing the opportunity to observe and learn from genuine philanthropic leadership. The keynote moment of the evening came when Harrison Wellington III introduced me to deliver the address that would conclude the formal program. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harrison said from the podium, "it is my privilege to introduce someone who has transformed not just our foundation, but our entire understanding of what strategic philanthropy can accomplish. Please join me in welcoming Margaret Thompson, founder of the Thompson Institute and the visionary leader who has guided our work for the past 4 decades. The sustained applause that followed Harrison's introduction was the kind of genuine appreciation that reflected deep respect for meaningful accomplishment. But Miranda's reaction was confusion rather than recognition, because she had never connected the Margaret Thompson being honored with the modest elderly woman she had been dismissing as David's embarrassing mother. I approached the podium wearing the same simple navy dress I had worn throughout the evening, carrying my modest canvas bag and moving with the quiet dignity that had characterized my entire approach to philanthropic leadership. To anyone who hadn't been paying attention to the evening's program, I would have appeared to be a member of the hotel staff rather than the guest of honor. My keynote address focused on the future of strategic philanthropy and the importance of authentic commitment to helping others rather than using charitable work for personal advancement. I spoke about the need for collaboration, outcome measurement, and systematic approaches to addressing complex social problems. But I also spoke about the importance of recognizing that everyone deserves respect and dignity, regardless of their apparent circumstances or social status. I talked about how authentic philanthropic work required genuine concern for others, rather than superficial networking or social climbing. True philanthropy, I said from the podium, is about service to others rather than advancement of ourselves. It's about recognizing the inherent worth and dignity of every person, and understanding that our responsibility to help others doesn't depend on what they can do for us in return. The audience responded to my address with the kind of thoughtful attention that indicated they understood the deeper messages about values and character that were embedded in my remarks about philanthropic strategy. But Miranda's reaction was impatience rather than engagement, because she was focused on the networking reception that would follow, rather than the content of my presentation. After my keynote address, the formal program concluded and guests moved to the hotel's grand ballroom for the networking reception that would provide final opportunities for conversation and relationship building. This was the moment Miranda had been anticipating all evening, her chance to approach the most influential guests when they were relaxed and more likely to engage in the kind of substantive conversations that could advance her social goals. But Miranda's approach to the networking reception revealed that she had learned nothing from her earlier failures during the pre-dinner reception. She continued to target people based on their apparent wealth and importance, making superficial comments and asking questions that revealed her lack of genuine interest in charitable work. The most catastrophic moment came when Miranda encountered me near the silent auction displays, where I was examining the items that had been donated by local businesses and artists to support the foundation's work. I was still carrying my modest canvas bag, and still wearing my simple navy dress, appearing to be exactly what Miranda had always assumed I was, a working-class woman who was out of place at an elegant charity event. Miranda's decision to approach me was motivated by her frustration with her lack of social success throughout the evening. She had been unable to establish meaningful connections with any of the influential guests she had targeted, and she was looking for someone she could dominate socially to restore her sense of control and superiority. "Excuse me," Miranda said, using the condescending tone she reserved for people she considered beneath her social aspirations. "I think you might be in the wrong area. This reception is for gala guests, not hotel staff." The assumption that I was hotel staff was revealing but not surprising given Miranda's pattern of judging people based on superficial appearances. What was shocking was her decision to confront me publicly rather than simply ignoring my presence, or asking a hotel manager to address what she perceived as a service issue. "I'm sorry," I replied politely, maintaining the modest demeanor that had served me so well over the years. "I was just looking at the auction items. They're quite impressive." Quote, Miranda's response revealed the full extent of her arrogance and sense of entitlement. "These auction items are for our guests to bid on," she said, in a tone that suggested she was being generous by explaining something I couldn't possibly understand. "I'm sure there are other areas of the hotel where you're supposed to be working." The phrase "our guests" was particularly telling because it revealed Miranda's desperate need to position herself as an insider rather than acknowledging that she was actually a relative newcomer to the charitable community who had never been fully accepted by its established members. But Miranda's most catastrophic mistake was her decision to call hotel security to have me removed from the reception area. "Excuse me," she said to James Martinez, who had approached to ensure that everything was proceeding smoothly. "This woman appears to be hotel staff, but she's mingling with the guests instead of working. Could you please escort her to wherever she's supposed to be?" James's expression of shock and horror in response to Miranda's request was immediate and unmistakable. As the hotel's general manager, he knew exactly who I was and understood the magnitude of Miranda's mistake. But his professional training required him to handle the situation with discretion and diplomacy. "Ma'am," James said to Miranda in a tone that was carefully controlled, "I believe there may be some confusion. This is Ms. Margaret Thompson, the guest of honor for this evening's gala." Miranda's response to James's correction revealed the depth of her self-absorption and her inability to process information that contradicted her assumptions. "That's impossible," she said with a laugh that suggested she found the idea ridiculous. "Margaret Thompson is the famous philanthropist who was honored tonight. This is obviously just a janitor or cleaning lady." The phrase, "just a janitor," was the moment when Miranda's cruelty became public and undeniable. Several other guests had overheard her exchange with James, and they had turned to observe what was happening with expressions of shock and disgust. Eleanor Washington, who had witnessed Miranda's earlier superficial networking attempts, was standing close enough to hear Miranda's dismissive comment about me being just a janitor. Her expression of horror reflected her understanding of both who I actually was and what Miranda's comment revealed about her character. "Miranda," David said urgently, having approached when he noticed the commotion, "that's my mother, and she's also Margaret Thompson, the founder of the Thompson Institute." David's intervention was motivated by his genuine love for me and his horror at his wife's behavior, but it also revealed his own embarrassment at being married to someone who could make such a catastrophic social mistake. But Miranda's response to David's correction was to double down on her mistake rather than acknowledging her error and apologizing. "David, that's ridiculous," she said in a tone that suggested he was being deceived or confused. "Your mother is a working-class woman who does volunteer work. She couldn't possibly be the Margaret Thompson who founded a major foundation." The phrase, quote, "couldn't possibly be," was the moment when Miranda's assumptions about class, appearance, and social status were fully exposed to everyone present. She had revealed that she judged people's worth and capabilities based entirely on superficial markers of wealth and sophistication. But more damaging than Miranda's assumptions was her decision to continue arguing rather than accepting the correction she was receiving from multiple sources. Her need to be right was more important to her than the possibility that she might be making a terrible mistake. "I think there's been enough confusion," I said quietly, deciding that it was time to end the performance that had served its purpose. "James, could you please make an announcement to the guests?" James nodded with obvious relief, grateful for the opportunity to clarify the situation and restore appropriate dignity to the evening's proceedings. He moved to the center of the ballroom and spoke in a voice that carried clearly throughout the space. "Ladies and gentlemen," James announced, "I'd like to thank you for joining us this evening to honor Ms. Margaret Thompson, the founder of the Thompson Institute for Philanthropic Innovation and the visionary leader who has guided the Wellington Foundation's work for the past 4 decades. Ms. Thompson, would you like to say a few words?" The response from the assembled guests was immediate and overwhelming. The sustained applause that followed James's announcement was accompanied by expressions of respect, admiration, and genuine affection that reflected the deep appreciation the charitable community felt for my contributions to their work. But Miranda's reaction was horror and disbelief, rather than understanding and apology. She had finally realized the magnitude of her mistake, but her response was to blame others for her confusion, rather than taking responsibility for her assumptions and behavior. "This is impossible," Miranda said to David in a voice that was loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "Why didn't you tell me that your mother was Margaret Thompson? How was I supposed to know that she was famous?" David's response was immediate and decisive. "Miranda, I told you about my mother's work dozens of times. You never listened because you weren't interested in anything that didn't involve wealthy people or social advancement." David's public criticism of his wife was motivated by his genuine embarrassment and anger at her behavior, but it also marked the moment when their marriage began to dissolve publicly, in front of the most influential people in Seattle's charitable community. But the most devastating aspect of Miranda's situation was the response from the other guests. who had witnessed her treatment of me and understood exactly what her behavior revealed about her character and values. The charitable community had always been suspicious of Miranda's motivations, and her public cruelty towards someone she considered powerless had confirmed their worst suspicions. Eleanor Washington approached me with an expression of concern and support. "Margaret, I'm so sorry that you had to experience that kind of treatment," she said in a voice that was intended to be heard by other guests. "It's particularly unfortunate that someone would attend a charity gala and then demonstrate such a complete lack of understanding about the values that bring us together." Eleanor's comment was carefully phrased to ensure that Miranda understood how her behavior was being interpreted by the people she had been trying to impress. The charitable community valued respect, dignity, and authentic concern for others, and Miranda had demonstrated that she possessed none of these qualities. The response from other guests was similar: expressions of support for me and subtle but clear disapproval of Miranda's behavior. Within minutes, Miranda had been effectively ostracized from the charitable community that she had been trying to join for years. But the immediate social consequences were only the beginning of Miranda's problems. Her public humiliation of me had been witnessed by business leaders, media representatives, and social influencers who understood exactly what her behavior revealed about her character. The story of Miranda's mistake spread rapidly through Seattle's social and business communities, carried by guests who understood that her treatment of me was representative of how she would treat anyone she considered beneath her aspirations. The narrative that emerged was devastating: a social climber who had revealed her true character by publicly humiliating someone she thought was powerless. The media coverage that followed was extensive and damaging, focusing on the broader implications of Miranda's behavior for understanding authenticity and character in charitable work. The story resonated with audiences because it represented a perfect example of how superficial judgments and social climbing could lead to catastrophic mistakes. But perhaps the most devastating consequence for Miranda was the impact on her marriage to David. His public criticism of her behavior at the gala had marked the beginning of a process that would end their relationship within weeks. David's love for me and his horror at Miranda's treatment of me had finally forced him to confront the reality of who his wife had become. The woman he had married was someone whose values were fundamentally incompatible with basic human decency and respect for others. Miranda, David said during their final conversation, "I can't be married to someone who would treat my mother that way. But more importantly, I can't be married to someone who would treat anyone that way. Your behavior at the gala showed me exactly who you really are." The divorce proceedings that followed were swift and decisive, with David refusing to provide any financial support beyond what was legally required. Miranda's expensive lifestyle and social climbing ambitions had been entirely dependent on David's income, and her loss of financial support meant that she could no longer maintain the sophisticated image that had been central to her identity. But the most permanent consequence of Miranda's mistake was her complete exclusion from Seattle's charitable community. The story of her behavior at the gala had established her as someone whose motivations were purely selfish and whose treatment of others was unacceptable. The charitable organizations that had previously tolerated her presence at events began to decline her requests for invitations. The social circles she had been trying to join closed their doors permanently. The reputation she had spent years building was destroyed in a single evening. Miranda's attempts to rebuild her social standing were futile, because the charitable community had concluded that her behavior at the gala was representative of her true character, rather than an isolated mistake. People who would treat someone they considered powerless with such cruelty couldn't be trusted to demonstrate genuine concern for others in any situation. The final irony was that Miranda's desperate attempt to establish her social superiority by humiliating someone she considered beneath her had exposed her to exactly the kind of public humiliation she had been trying to avoid throughout her social climbing career. Today, nearly a year after the Wellington Foundation Gala, Miranda has moved back to Tacoma and is working as a receptionist at a medical office, her social climbing ambitions permanently destroyed by her decision to dismiss someone as just a janitor. The expensive lifestyle and sophisticated image that had been central to her identity are gone, replaced by the modest circumstances she had spent her entire adult life trying to escape. David has remarried to a nurse practitioner who genuinely shares his values and who treats everyone with respect and kindness regardless of their circumstances. His new wife attends charity events because she cares about the causes being supported, not because she wants to advance her social status. And me? I continue to live exactly the life I deserve, surrounded by people who understand that true worth comes from service to others rather than the accumulation of wealth or status. The Wellington Foundation continues to grow and create positive change throughout the region, guided by the principles of collaboration, respect, and authentic commitment to helping others that have defined my entire career. The woman Miranda thought she could dismiss as just a janitor had taught her a lesson about power, influence, and justice that she would remember for the rest of her life. And everyone who witnessed her education understood that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who looks like they couldn't possibly hurt you. The Four Seasons Hotel still hosts charity events regularly, and James Martinez still tells the story of the evening when a social climber learned that judging people by their appearance could result in consequences far more severe than anything she had ever imagined. Justice isn't always swift, but when it comes, it's usually more complete than the people who deserve it expect. Miranda discovered that truth in the most public and humiliating way possible, and now the entire charitable community knows exactly what happens when someone chooses cruelty over kindness and discovers too late that they've picked the wrong person to humiliate. The stage had been set for justice, and justice had been delivered by someone who understood that protecting the values of respect, dignity, and authentic service to others was worth any effort required to ensure that people like Miranda faced appropriate consequences for their cruelty. And every time someone treats a service worker with kindness instead of condescension, or approaches charitable work with genuine concern instead of social climbing ambition, they're contributing to a world where character matters more than appearances, and where people like Miranda learn that their behavior has consequences they never anticipated. That's a world worth building, and it's a world that starts with understanding that everyone deserves respect and dignity, regardless of how they appear or what they can do for your personal advancement. The lesson Miranda learned that night was simple, but profound. Never underestimate someone based on their appearance, because sometimes, the person you think you can dismiss as just a janitor is actually someone who has spent their entire life building the resources and relationships necessary to ensure that cruelty doesn't go unpunished. And in a world where authentic values and genuine service to others are increasingly rare, that's a lesson that more people need to learn before they make the same catastrophic mistake that destroyed Miranda's life and taught everyone who witnessed it that justice, when it comes, is both swift and complete. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.